Some children arrived at the Brattleboro retreat already knowing how many would never leave. The facility sits in the southeastern corner of Vermont, where the West River bends through a valley that early settlers described as touched by permanent shadow. Founded in 1834, the Brattleboro Retreat became Vermont's first institution dedicated to the treatment of mental illness, predating the state asylum by more than half a century. The original campus sprawled across 200 acres of farmland and forest, its main building a Georgian revival structure of hand-laid brick that locals called the Quiet Mansion on the Hill. The town of Brattleboro itself had grown around the intersection of the Connecticut and West Rivers, a geography that made it a natural trading hub, but also gave it a reputation for strange acoustics. Sounds carried differently in the valley. Conversations held near the covered bridge could be heard clearly at the train depot, half a mile away. Hunters reported gunshots that echoed for minutes, bouncing between the hills until the original direction became impossible to determine. The retreat's founders chose this location deliberately. They believed the isolation would benefit patients. That distance from the industrial centers of Boston and New York would allow for quiet recovery. What they didn't anticipate was that the valley's peculiar properties would amplify something else entirely, patterns that should have remained unnoticed. By 1845, the facility had expanded to include a dedicated children's ward in the East Wing, a 3-story addition built from locally quarried stone and 13,000 bricks transported from a kiln in nearby Guilford. 13,412 bricks, to be exact. That number would become significant. The first documented case appeared in the intake records of November 1847. A 9-year-old girl named Patience Holloway was admitted following what her family described as episodes of profound distraction. She had stopped speaking to her parents, stopped attending to her schoolwork, and spent hours staring at walls while moving her lips in silent recitation. Within 3 weeks of her arrival, attendants noted that Patience had begun counting aloud, not forward as children typically do when learning arithmetic, but backward. She would start at seemingly random numbers, 247, 119, 83, and count down to 0 with mechanical precision, never losing her place, never pausing. Dr. Hiram Caldwell, the retreat's superintendent, initially dismissed this as a symptom of her underlying condition. He prescribed rest, fresh air, and limited stimulation. But when a junior physician named Edmund Hartley cross-referenced Patience's numbers with the facility's administrative records, he discovered something that would trouble him for the rest of his career. 247 was the exact patient census on the day Patience began counting. 119 matched the number of deaths recorded at the facility since its founding. 83 was the number of children who had been admitted to the East Wing. Dr. Hartley documented his findings in a private journal, noting that the girl could not have accessed these figures. Patient records were kept in a locked office. Death totals were calculated only during annual reports. The census changed daily, yet Patience's numbers aligned perfectly every time. She was not the last. Over the following 5 decades, staff recorded 17 additional cases of what internal documents eventually termed regressive enumeration. The children shared no common diagnosis, no overlapping family histories, no geographic origin. They arrived from Vermont, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and as far away as Pennsylvania. Their ages ranged from 6 to 14. Some had been admitted for melancholia, others for what physicians then called moral insanity or deficiency of intellect. But each child, within 1 to 3 weeks of placement in the East Wing, began counting backward. Margaret Stowe, admitted in 1861, counted from 409, the precise number of window panes in the main building, a figure that appeared in no document accessible to patients or even most staff. A boy named Thomas Driscoll, admitted in 1874, counted from 57, the number of staff members employed at the facility that month, according to payroll records discovered decades later. In 1889, twin sisters named Clara and Josephine Merritt were admitted together following the death of their mother. Within 2 weeks, both began counting from the same number, 13,412. Neither girl had been outside the ward. Neither had been told the construction history of the building, 13,412 bricks. A night attendant named Horace Belknap documented the twins' behavior in a letter to his brother, a mathematics professor at Dartmouth College. "They count in unison," Belknap wrote, "as if sharing a single mind. When I asked how they knew the number, Clara looked at me with such calm certainty and said, 'The walls told us how many pieces they're made of.' I did not sleep that night, nor many nights after." Belknap's brother visited the facility in the spring of 1890. He brought measuring tools and spent 3 days calculating the brick count of the East Wing. His final tally, 13,412. He never published his findings. His personal papers, donated to Dartmouth after his death in 1922, contained a single note about the visit. Some knowledge should not be verified. The retreat's administration responded to these incidents with increasing unease. Dr. Caldwell retired in 1868 and was replaced by Dr. Nathaniel Proctor, a man more interested in institutional reputation than scientific inquiry. Under Proctor's leadership, references to regressive enumeration were gradually removed from official patient files. But the behavior continued. In 1897, the Vermont Medical Society dispatched a small committee to investigate rumors of unusual phenomena at the retreat. The committee, led by Dr. Solomon Bancroft of Burlington, spent 2 weeks interviewing staff and reviewing records. Their final report, submitted in January 1898, has never been located in state archives. A receipt confirms its delivery to the Society's offices in Montpelier. No copy exists in their holdings today. Dr. Bancroft's personal correspondence offers fragments of what the committee observed. In a letter to a colleague at Johns Hopkins, he wrote, "The children do not seem distressed by what they know. They count as one might breathe, automatically without conscious effort. When the counting reaches 0, they simply stop and resume their previous activities, as if nothing had occurred. None could explain where the numbers came from. Several insisted they had always known them, that the numbers had been waiting inside them since before they arrived." Bancroft requested permission to conduct a controlled study, bringing in mathematicians and architects to verify the figures the children produced. The retreat's Board of Trustees denied the request. The matter, they wrote, does not merit further investigation and risks unnecessary attention to isolated curiosities of no medical significance. 3 months later, the East Wing was closed for renovations. The children were relocated to a newer facility in Waterbury. The counting stopped. The East Wing stood unused for 5 years before the trustees authorized its demolition in 1903. The official reasons cited structural concerns, settling foundations, water damage to the lower floors. But construction records from the period indicate the building had been inspected just 2 years earlier and deemed sound for another half-century of use. Workers dismantled the structure over the summer of 1903. Several reported strange experiences during the demolition. A foreman named Augustus Keene noted in his work log that his crew consistently miscounted materials. "Every tally comes out wrong on the first attempt," he wrote. "We count lumber, we count nails, we count bricks as we remove them. Always off by the same margin until we count again. It's as if the numbers resist being known." The bricks were sold to a construction company in Massachusetts. The stone foundation was buried on site. Within 3 years, the location was converted to a formal garden, and the East Wing was erased from facility maps. In 1962, a graduate student at the University of Vermont named Dorothy Paulson attempted to research the history of child psychiatric care in New England. Her requests to access pre-1900 records from the Brattleboro Retreat were denied. When she contacted the Vermont Historical Society for related materials, she was informed that several medical journals from the 1800s had been removed from the collection in 1958. No explanation was provided. No record of who authorized the removal exists. Paulson's thesis, completed in 1964, contains a single footnote about the Brattleboro Retreat. Certain aspects of the institution's early history remain inaccessible. Archival gaps suggest deliberate curation rather than accidental loss. The formal garden where the East Wing once stood still exists today, though it has been redesigned several times over the past century. Visitors occasionally report a strange compulsion while walking its paths, an urge to count steps, count stones, count the leaves on the maple trees that now shade the area. In 2011, a maintenance worker replacing a damaged bench discovered a fragment of the original foundation beneath the topsoil. Carved into the stone, in letters too precise to be accidental, was a sequence of numbers, 247, 119, 83. The worker photographed the stone and reported it to the facility's administration. By the time a supervisor arrived to inspect the find, the fragment had been removed. Groundskeeping records show no authorization for its disposal. No one has been able to explain who carved the numbers, or when, or why they match the figures that Patience Holloway counted in 1847. Some patterns, it seems, prefer to remain unfinished. The children who counted backward have been gone for more than a century now. Their names appear in no histories. Their numbers lead nowhere. But somewhere in Vermont, in archives that may or may not still exist, there are pages that document what they knew. Pages that someone, at some point, decided the world wasn't supposed to read. The question isn't what the children were counting. The question is what happens when the count reaches 0. Every night at 3, Ward C held one more soul than it should have. The Vermont State Asylum for the Insane opened its doors in 1891, built on a sprawling campus in Waterbury, where the Winooski River curves through a valley flanked by the Green Mountains. The location was chosen for its natural beauty and its distance from population centers, a philosophy common to 19th century psychiatric care, which held that pastoral settings promoted mental recovery. The main building, a Kirkbride-plan structure of red brick and granite trim, stretched nearly 800 feet across manicured lawns that sloped gently toward the riverbank. Waterbury itself was a quiet town of fewer than 4,000 residents, known primarily for its lumber mills and its position along the Central Vermont Railway. The asylum quickly became the community's largest employer, and by 1900, the relationship between institution and town had settled into an uneasy coexistence. Locals worked at the facility, supplied it with goods, and whispered about what happened behind its walls. Few asked questions directly. Fewer still received answers. Ward C occupied the northeast corner of the 3rd floor, a long corridor of 16 private rooms originally designated for patients requiring close observation. Unlike the open dormitories elsewhere in the building, Ward C offered isolation, thick wooden doors, small windows set high in the walls, and a nursing station positioned at the corridor's only entrance. The ward's design was meant to contain disturbances, to muffle sounds that might unsettle patients in adjacent wings. It also meant that whatever happened in Ward C stayed in Ward C. The first recorded anomaly appeared in a shift log dated March 19, 1912. Nurse Edith Trowbridge had worked at the asylum for 7 years by the time she documented what she called the discrepancy. Her entry, written in the precise handwriting that characterized her reports described a routine bed check conducted at 3 in the morning. Counted all patients in Ward C as required. Total should be 14 per evening census. Count returned 15, recounted twice, 15 each time. Checked admission log, no new patients since 6 p.m. Checked all rooms individually, each occupied by one patient. 15 rooms occupied. Ward C contains only 16 rooms. Evening census recorded 14. Trowbridge reported the discrepancy to the day supervisor, a woman named Harriet Knowles, who reviewed the ward's paperwork and found no errors. The evening census clearly listed 14 patients. The morning census, conducted at 7, also listed 14. Whatever Trowbridge had counted at 3 in the morning had corrected itself by dawn. Knowles noted the incident in her own log, but took no further action. Miscounts happened. Nurses worked long shifts in poor lighting. The mind played tricks in the small hours. But 6 weeks later, another nurse reported the same phenomenon. Ruth Olmsted, newly hired and unfamiliar with Trowbridge's earlier report, documented a count of 15 patients in Ward C during her 3 a.m. rounds. Like Trowbridge, she recounted multiple times. Like Trowbridge, she found no explanation. And like Trowbridge, her count had returned to 14 by morning. Over the following 2 years, 9 additional nurses independently reported the discrepancy. Each incident occurred at 3 in the morning. Each involved Ward C specifically. Each nurse counted exactly one patient more than the official census allowed. In 1914, the asylum's superintendent, Dr. Wallace Pemberton, ordered a formal review of Ward C's records. The investigation lasted 3 weeks and produced a 40-page report that has since vanished from state archives. However, a summary memorandum survived in Dr. Pemberton's personal papers, donated to the Vermont Historical Society by his descendants in 1987. The matter of the Ward C census remains unresolved, Pemberton wrote. No evidence of clerical error or patient concealment has been identified. Staff interviewed expressed confidence in their observations. I am recommending discontinuation of 3 a.m. counts in Ward C, effective immediately, to be replaced by counts at 2:30 and 3:30. The adjustment made no difference. Nurses conducting the 2:30 count found 14 patients. Nurses returning at 3:30 found 14 patients. But those who happened to glance at the ward between those times, passing through the corridor, responding to a call bell, checking on a restless patient, consistently reported seeing 15 occupied beds. By 1920, the phenomenon had become an open secret among the asylum's overnight staff. New nurses were quietly warned during their first week, don't count Ward C at 3. If you must count, don't write down what you find. If you write it down, don't expect anyone to believe you. Gladys Fenwick, who worked at the facility from 1918 to 1934, gave an interview to a local historian in 1971. The recording, preserved in the Waterbury Historical Society's collection, captures her recollection in detail. We all knew, Fenwick said. Every girl who worked the night shift knew. You'd walk past Ward C around 3, and you'd feel it, this pull, like the ward wanted you to come in and count. Some of the younger nurses couldn't resist. They'd go in with their clipboards so sure they'd prove us old hens wrong. They'd come out pale as milk, every one of them. When asked what the nurses believed they were counting, Fenwick paused for nearly 30 seconds before responding. Nobody used the word ghost. That wasn't how we thought about it. It was more like a record that hadn't been erased, a number that kept showing up because it didn't know it wasn't supposed to exist anymore. We called it the leftover. Always just one, always at 3. Fenwick also recalled that older staff members connected the phenomenon to a specific event in the asylum's history, the transfer of patients from the Brattleboro Retreat following the closure of its chronic care wing in 1895. 17 patients were supposed to come to us that winter, she said. 17 left Brattleboro. 16 arrived in Waterbury. The records say the 17th died during transport, a woman named Viola, I think, or maybe Violet. Heart failure, they said, but no body was ever recovered. The wagon arrived with 16 patients, and no one could explain what happened to the 17th. The asylum's administrative records confirm a transfer of patients from Brattleboro in December 1895, though the specific documentation has significant gaps. A manifest lists 17 names departing Brattleboro on December 14th. An intake log at Waterbury lists 16 arrivals on December 16th. The two-day discrepancy was attributed to weather delays. A snowstorm had closed roads throughout central Vermont that week. No death certificate exists for a 17th patient. No burial record appears in either facility's files. The Vermont Department of Health has no documentation of a death during patient transport in December 1895. The name on the manifest, partially obscured by water damage, appears to read Viola Crane or possibly Violet Crane. No patient by either name appears in subsequent records at either institution. No family correspondence regarding her whereabouts has been located. She departed Brattleboro and, for all official purposes, simply ceased to exist somewhere along the 40-mile route to Waterbury. In 1936, a records clerk named Philip Dunmore attempted to trace the missing patient as part of a broader audit of historical files. His handwritten notes, discovered in a storage facility in 1992, reveal increasing frustration. V. Crane appears on no census after December 14, 1895. No transfer documentation, no discharge, no death record. I have requested clarification from the State Health Department 3 times. No response. I have requested the original transfer manifest from Brattleboro, informed it was destroyed in a 1904 filing cabinet fire. The fire affected only manifests from 1895, only December, only the Waterbury transfer. Dunmore's audit was never completed. He resigned from his position in February 1937, citing personal reasons. His subsequent whereabouts are unknown. The counting anomaly in Ward C continued until 1938, when a fire damaged the northeast corner of the third floor and forced the permanent closure of the ward. Patients were relocated to a newly constructed wing on the opposite side of the campus. Overnight staff reported no unusual census discrepancies in the new facility. The damaged section of the original building stood unused for nearly a decade before repairs were completed in 1947. When Ward C reopened, it was designated for geriatric patients rather than observation cases. The ward's layout had been altered during reconstruction, 15 rooms instead of 16. The nursing station moved to a central position, the corridor now featuring 2 entrances instead of 1. No census anomalies were ever reported in the rebuilt Ward C. But workers involved in the 1947 renovation later described an unusual discovery. Behind the plaster of the original northeast wall, they found marks, small scratches in the brick, arranged in groups of 17. The marks appeared at regular intervals along the wall's entire length, as if someone had been keeping count of something over a very long period. 17 marks, 17 groups, always 17. The foreman, a man named Gerald Strickland, ordered the marks photographed before the new plaster was applied. The photographs were included in the renovation's documentation file, which was stored in the facility's basement archive. The basement flooded in 1959. The file was among the losses. The Vermont State Asylum closed in 1985, its functions transferred to a smaller facility nearby. The original campus sat abandoned for decades, its buildings deteriorating, its grounds reclaimed by forest. In 2011, Tropical Storm Irene devastated Waterbury, flooding the empty asylum and accelerating its decay. The state demolished most of the structures in 2014, preserving only a handful of buildings for redevelopment. Ward C no longer exists. Its bricks were carted away, its foundations filled with gravel, its location now occupied by a parking lot serving the Vermont State Office complex. But records from the asylum's final decades contain one additional detail that researchers have struggled to explain. A 1973 inventory of the facility's historical archives noted that someone had been maintaining unofficial logs of Ward C's overnight census, handwritten tallies dating from 1912 to 1938, stored in a locked cabinet in the basement. The logs documented every reported discrepancy: the date, the time, the nurse's name, and the count. 294 incidents over 26 years. 294 nights when Ward C held one patient more than it should have. At the bottom of the final page, in handwriting that matched no known staff member, someone had written a single line: "She's still trying to arrive." The inventory clerk who discovered the logs requested permission to transfer them to the state archives for preservation. The request was denied. The cabinet was subsequently emptied, its contents listed as destroyed per administrative directive. No record indicates who issued the directive. No record indicates who wrote the final line. And no record explains why the total, 294, matches exactly 17 times 17, the number that kept appearing in the bricks, in the scratches, in the discrepancy between those who left Brattleboro and those who reached Waterbury on a winter night, when the roads were buried in snow and one patient was lost somewhere between departure and arrival. Some counts, it seems, refused to close. The symbols were never meant to be found. The Brandon Training School opened in 1815 as the first institution of its kind in the United States, a facility dedicated to the education and care of individuals deemed feeble-minded by the medical standards of the era. Located in the small town of Brandon, Vermont, where Otter Creek winds through a valley shadowed by the Taconic Range, the school began as a progressive experiment in compassionate treatment. Its founders believed that patients could be taught useful skills, that productive labor would restore dignity to those society had discarded. Brandon itself was a community of modest ambition, known for its marble quarries and its location along the rutted roads connecting Rutland to Middlebury. The training school sat at the town's northern edge, its campus eventually growing to include dormitories, workshops, a working farm, and a cemetery that would, over the next century and a half, receive more than 200 unmarked burials. By 1870, the school had shifted from education to long-term custodial care. Patients arrived as children and often remained for life. The institution's population swelled, its facilities expanded, and its philosophy hardened into something closer to containment than treatment. Work programs that had once been therapeutic became essential to the school's economy. Patients tended livestock, harvested crops, laundered linens, and, in a workshop established in 1883, sewed garments for state institutions throughout New England. The sewing workshop occupied a long, low building adjacent to the main dormitory, its windows facing north to provide consistent light for detailed needlework. At its peak, the workshop employed up to 60 female patients at a time, producing uniforms, bedding, curtains, and clothing for hospitals, orphanages, and prisons across Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. The work was relentless, the documentation was meticulous, and for nearly half a century, no one noticed what 12 of those women were stitching into the seams. The first recorded observation appeared in 1931, buried in a quality control report filed by a workshop supervisor named Constance Aldridge. The report, discovered in a storage facility in 1994, documented a shipment of bed linens returned by the Vermont State Prison in Windsor. 14 sheets rejected due to unauthorized markings in hemstitching, Aldridge wrote. Symbols appear decorative but match no approved patterns. Origin of design unknown. Recommend inspection of current seamstress assignments. Aldridge conducted an internal review but could not identify which patients had worked on the rejected linens. The workshop operated on a rotation system. Patients moved between stations weekly, and detailed attribution records were not maintained. She noted the incident, implemented additional inspections, and considered the matter closed. But the symbols kept appearing. Over the following 6 years, Aldridge documented 43 separate instances of unauthorized embroidery in outgoing shipments. The markings were consistent, small geometric patterns stitched in thread that matched the surrounding fabric, visible only upon close examination or when held against strong light. They appeared in hems, linings, seams, and collar folds, places where casual inspection would never reveal them. In 1937, Aldridge began photographing the symbols and comparing them across shipments. Her personal notebook, recovered with the quality control reports, contains meticulous sketches and measurements. The patterns, she determined, were not random. They repeated with mathematical precision a series of interlocking angles that formed a shape she could not identify, bordered by smaller marks that resembled neither letters nor numbers from any alphabet she recognized. "The symbols are identical," she wrote in March of that year. "Not similar, identical, measured to the quarter inch. Whoever is creating these has either memorized an extremely complex pattern or is copying from a source I have not been able to locate." Aldridge began quietly observing the workshop floor, noting which patients demonstrated unusual focus or skill. Within 3 months, she had identified 12 women whose work consistently appeared in flagged shipments. None of the 12 had ever been assigned to the same shift. None shared a dormitory room. According to intake records, they had been admitted across a span of 34 years, from 1898 to 1932. The oldest was 61. The youngest was 19. They had no documented connection whatsoever. Aldridge requested a meeting with the school superintendent, Dr. Howard Tisdale, in June 1937. The meeting was granted but never officially recorded. What followed comes from a letter Aldridge wrote to her sister in Montpelier, discovered among family papers in 2003. "Dr. Tisdale listened to my findings with what I can only describe as practiced disinterest," she wrote. "When I showed him the photographs, he examined them briefly and returned them without comment. When I explained that 12 unconnected patients were producing identical work, he asked if I was suggesting they were communicating in some way. I said I didn't know. He said perhaps I was overworked. He said the symbols were likely a coincidence, a common folk pattern I had failed to recognize. He suggested I take a week's leave." Aldridge did not take leave. Instead, she began conducting unauthorized interviews with the 12 patients, meeting with each individually during evening recreation hours. Her notes from these conversations are fragmentary. Several pages appear to have been deliberately torn from her notebook, but enough remains to reconstruct what she learned. Each patient, when shown the symbol, recognized it immediately. Each claimed to have known the pattern since childhood, long before their admission to Brandon. Each described learning it from a female relative, a mother, grandmother, or aunt, who had also been institutionalized at some point in their lives. And each insisted that the symbol had a purpose, though none could articulate what that purpose was. "It's for finding," one patient reportedly said, "so we can be found." "It marks us," said another, "so they know we're still here." When Aldridge asked who they referred to, the patient fell silent and would not speak again for the remainder of the interview. Aldridge's investigation ended abruptly in August 1937. Her employment records show a transfer to administrative duties effective immediately, with no explanation provided. She remained at Brandon until 1942, when she resigned to care for an ailing parent. She never returned to supervisory work. The sewing workshop continued operations until 1979, when the Brandon Training School was renamed and restructured following a series of abuse investigations. The workshop was closed, its equipment sold, its records transferred to state archives in Montpellier. In 1978, 1 year before the closure, a different supervisor, a woman named Margaret Kowalski, who had worked at the facility since 1954, gave an interview to a journalist investigating conditions at Vermont's state institutions. The interview was recorded but never published. The journalist's notes were donated to the University of Vermont's Special Collections in 1996. Kowalski confirmed Aldridge's observations from 4 decades earlier. "The 12 were still there when I started," she said. Well, not the same 12. Some had died, some had been transferred. But there were always 12, always women, always stitching those same symbols when they thought no one was watching. The journalist asked how new members were identified. "I don't think they were identified," Kowalski replied. "I think they just knew. A new patient would arrive, and within a few weeks she'd be doing it too. No one taught her. No one showed her the pattern. She just started, like she'd been waiting her whole life to learn a secret she already knew." Kowalski also revealed that she had collected samples of the unauthorized embroidery over her 24 years of supervision, small swatches cut from rejected garments hidden in a lockbox in her home. She offered to show them to the journalist. The interview ends without resolution. The journalist's notes contain no description of the samples. No follow-up interview was scheduled. Kowalski died in 1989. Her estate was managed by a nephew in Massachusetts who reported finding no lockbox among her possessions. The symbols themselves have never been definitively identified. Photographs from Aldridge's notebook were examined by a textile historian at the Smithsonian in 2008, who concluded that the patterns resembled no known European or American folk tradition. The interlocking angles, she noted, bore superficial similarity to certain Germanic hex signs, but the proportions were wrong, and the smaller surrounding marks had no parallel in any documented needlework tradition. A separate analysis by a linguistics professor at Middlebury College suggested the marks might represent a simplified notation system, not a language exactly, but a method of encoding information in visual form. "Like musical notation," she wrote in her assessment, "but for something other than sound." She was unable to determine what information might be encoded. Her request to examine additional samples was declined by the Vermont State Archives, which reported that no embroidery samples from the Brandon workshop had been retained in their holdings. The 12 patients identified by Aldridge have proven equally difficult to trace. Intake records from the relevant period are incomplete, and many files were destroyed during the facility's 1979 reorganization. Of the 12 names Aldridge documented, only 7 appear in surviving records. Of those 7, 4 were transferred to other institutions before 1945. Their subsequent histories are unknown. The remaining 3 died at Brandon and were buried in the facility's cemetery. Their graves, like most in that section of the grounds, bear no headstones, only small numbered markers that correspond to a burial ledger that was lost in a 1963 administrative office fire. The Brandon Training School closed permanently in 1993. Its buildings were demolished over the following decade, and the land was eventually sold to a private developer. Today, the site is occupied by a retirement community whose residents are largely unaware of what stood there before. The cemetery remains. State law prohibits development on burial grounds, and the site has been preserved as a small memorial park maintained by the town of Brandon. Volunteers have attempted to identify the individuals buried there using surviving records, but fewer than 40 of the estimated 218 graves have been successfully matched to names. In 2015, a retired nurse who had worked at Brandon during its final years contacted the Vermont Historical Society with an unusual donation, a single swatch of fabric, approximately 4 inches square, embroidered with the symbol Aldridge had documented nearly 80 years earlier. The nurse, who requested anonymity, explained that she had found the fabric tucked into the lining of a coat donated to a Rutland thrift store in 1994. The coat had no label, no identifying marks, no indication of its origin, but the symbol was unmistakable. "I knew what it was the moment I saw it," she told the archivist who accepted the donation. "I'd heard stories from the older staff. I never believed them until I held that piece of fabric in my hands." The swatch is now stored in the Society's collection, cataloged but not displayed. Researchers who have examined it note that the stitching is extraordinarily precise. Too precise, some have argued, to have been produced by hand. When measured, the symbol spans exactly 3 7/16 inches in each direction. The same measurement Aldrich recorded in 1937, the same measurement Kowalski described in 1978. The same measurement, presumably, that 12 women across nearly a century stitched into the hidden places of garments sent to hospitals and prisons and orphanages throughout New England. Garments that have long since been discarded, destroyed, or lost. But fabric endures longer than memory. Thread outlasts the hands that guide it. And somewhere, perhaps, in the lining of a coat or the hem of a dress or the seam of a pillowcase folded in an attic trunk, the symbol waits, still marking, still counting, still hoping to be found. Dr. Elias Whitmore signed his name 43 times at a hospital he never entered. The Brattleboro Retreat sits in the Connecticut River Valley of southeastern Vermont, where the town of Brattleboro grew around the convergence of waterways and railway lines in the mid-19th century. Founded in 1834, the retreat was Vermont's first institution dedicated to the treatment of mental illness, predating the state asylum by more than 50 years. Its founders envisioned a place of quiet recovery, where patients could heal through rest, labor, and the calming influence of pastoral surroundings. By 1880, the facility had expanded considerably. The original Georgian Revival building had been supplemented by additional wings, outbuildings, and a network of walking paths that wound through 200 acres of manicured grounds. The patient population had grown to nearly 300, and the medical staff had expanded to accommodate them: a superintendent, 4 attending physicians, and a rotating roster of junior doctors who came to Brattleboro to gain experience before establishing private practices elsewhere. The town itself had become a minor hub of commerce and culture, known for its printing houses, its organ manufactory, and its position as a gateway to the Green Mountains. Visitors arrived by rail from Boston and New York, some seeking treatment at the retreat, others simply passing through on their way to the mineral springs and resort hotels that dotted the Vermont countryside. It was into this environment that Dr. Elias Whitmore was expected to arrive on March 3, 1881. He had been hired the previous autumn following a correspondence with the retreat's superintendent, Dr. Frederick Bancroft. The letters, preserved in the facility's administrative archives, paint a picture of an accomplished young physician eager to specialize in nervous disorders. Whitmore described his training at Albany Medical College, his residency at a private hospital in upstate New York, and his particular interest in what he called diseases of perception, conditions in which patients experienced sensory phenomena that could not be externally verified. Bancroft was impressed. The retreat needed physicians with specialized interests, and Whitmore's credentials seemed impeccable. A contract was drawn up, a salary agreed upon, and a start date established: the first Monday of March, 1881. The date came and went. Whitmore did not appear. The first indication of trouble surfaced in a letter Bancroft wrote to the Albany Medical College on March 15, 1881, requesting confirmation of Whitmore's credentials. "Dr. Whitmore has not arrived as scheduled," Bancroft wrote, "and I have received no communication explaining his absence. I write to inquire whether you might have a forwarding address or any information regarding his current whereabouts." The college's response, dated April 2nd, was brief and puzzling. They had no record of an Elias Whitmore graduating from their program. They had no record of anyone by that name ever enrolling. They suggested Bancroft might be mistaken about the institution. Bancroft wrote back, insisting on the accuracy of his information. He included excerpts from Whitmore's original letters, which referenced specific professors and coursework at Albany Medical College. The college's second response, dated April 19th, was firmer. No Elias Whitmore had ever studied medicine in Albany, and the professors named in the letters had not taught the courses described. The correspondence ended there. Bancroft, apparently satisfied that he had been the victim of an elaborate fraud, noted the matter in his administrative log and began searching for a replacement physician. But the situation grew more complicated 3 weeks later, when a patient intake form dated March 27th crossed his desk, bearing the signature of Dr. Elias Whitmore. The form documented the admission of a 43-year-old woman named Harriet Conroy, committed by her family for what they described as persistent delusions of temporal displacement. The attending physician's notes were thorough: observations of the patient's behavior, a preliminary diagnosis, recommendations for treatment. The handwriting was neat, professional, and entirely unfamiliar to anyone on staff. Bancroft summoned his attending physicians and questioned each individually. None had admitted Harriet Conroy. None recognized the handwriting. None had ever met anyone claiming to be Dr. Whitmore. Yet the form was genuine. It had been filed in the proper location, using the facility's standard paperwork, stamped with the correct date. The patient herself had arrived and was currently residing in the women's ward. When questioned, she confirmed that a doctor had conducted her intake examination, a young man with dark hair and a calm demeanor who had introduced himself as Dr. Whitmore. She described him clearly: tall, slender, wearing a gray suit beneath his medical coat. He had asked detailed questions about her episodes, as he called them, moments when she felt she was experiencing events out of their proper sequence. He had been kind, she said, attentive. He had told her she would be well cared for at the retreat. She had not seen him since. Over the following 8 months, 42 additional intake forms bearing Whitmore's signature appeared in the facility's records. Each documented a legitimate admission. Each patient confirmed being examined by a physician matching the same description. Each form was properly completed and filed, and not a single member of the retreat staff ever saw the man who signed them. Bancroft's private journals, donated to the Vermont Historical Society in 1926, reveal his growing unease with the situation. He instituted new security measures, sign-in logs at every entrance, mandatory identification checks, increased oversight of the intake process. None of it made a difference. The forms continue to appear, he wrote in July 1881. Always dated, always signed, always documenting patients who have genuinely arrived at our facility. I have stationed attendants at the admissions office around the clock. They report nothing unusual, yet the signatures persist. Bancroft also documented his attempts to trace Whitmore through other channels. He contacted medical boards in New York, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania. He wrote to hospitals in Albany, Syracuse, and Boston. He even hired a private investigator to search for any record of an Elias Whitmore practicing medicine in the northeastern United States. The investigator's report, delivered in September 1881, contained an unexpected discovery. An Elias Whitmore had indeed existed, but he had died in Albany, New York, in 1878, 3 years before his supposed correspondence with the Brattleboro Retreat. The death certificate, obtained from the Albany City Clerk's office, listed the cause as typhoid fever. Whitmore had been 26 years old at the time of his death. He had been a medical student, not a licensed physician. He had never completed his studies. But here, the records became strange. The New York State Medical Board showed an Elias Whitmore receiving his medical license in 1881, 3 years after his documented death. The license application, which the investigator managed to examine, bore a signature that matched the intake forms at the Brattleboro retreat perfectly. The application listed a forwarding address, the Brattleboro Retreat, Brattleboro, Vermont. Bancroft never publicly disclosed these findings. His journal entries from the autumn of 1881 become increasingly fragmented, focusing on administrative matters and avoiding any mention of Whitmore. The final intake form bearing Whitmore's signature is dated November 14, 1881. After that, the signatures simply stopped. No explanation was ever recorded. No investigation was ever formally closed. The 43 patients admitted under Whitmore's care remained at the facility, their files indistinguishable from any others, except for the name of the physician who had examined them. In 1903, a clerk reorganizing the retreat's archives discovered the Whitmore intake forms and flagged them for review. The superintendent at the time, Dr. Leonard Holloway, examined the files and noted their unusual provenance in a memorandum to the Board of Trustees. The Whitmore matter appears to have been an administrative anomaly of unknown origin, he wrote. I recommend no further action. The patients in question received appropriate care regardless of the irregularities in their admission paperwork. The board agreed. The files were returned to storage, and the matter was officially forgotten. But Holloway privately made one additional inquiry. He wrote to the Albany City Clerk's office requesting a copy of Elias Whitmore's death certificate, the same document Bancroft's investigator had obtained 22 years earlier. The clerk's response was apologetic. No death certificate for an Elias Whitmore existed in their records. No one by that name had died in Albany in 1878 or in any other year on file. Holloway's letter to the clerk and the clerk's response were found tucked into the back of his personal diary, which his family donated to Middlebury College in 1961. A handwritten note, apparently added by Holloway some years later, accompanied the correspondence. I do not understand how a record can exist and not exist simultaneously, he wrote. I do not understand how a man can die, receive a license, and sign documents at a hospital he never visited. I have chosen not to understand. Some questions are better left unexamined. The Brattleboro Retreat continues to operate today, though the original buildings have been extensively modified, and the institution's approach to mental health care has evolved considerably since the 19th century. The Whitmore intake forms remain in the facility's historical archives, accessible to researchers with appropriate credentials. In 2009, a graduate student at the University of Vermont requested access to the forms as part of a dissertation on administrative practices in 19th century psychiatric institutions. Her analysis confirmed what earlier examiners had noted. The 43 signatures were consistent with one another, showing the natural variations expected from a single individual writing over an extended period. They were not traced, not forged, not mechanically reproduced. Whoever signed those forms did so by hand, over a period of 8 months, in a facility whose staff never saw him enter or leave. The student also made one additional observation that had escaped previous notice. The 43 patients admitted under Whitmore's signature shared a peculiar commonality. Each had been committed for conditions involving disturbances of time perception. Harriet Conroy and her temporal displacement. A farmer from Newfane who believed he was reliving the same week repeatedly. A seamstress from Bennington who claimed to remember events that had not yet occurred. 43 patients, all experiencing variations of the same impossible symptom. All examined by a physician who had died before he could complete his training, received his license after his death, and arrived at a hospital where he never set foot. The student's dissertation was completed in 2011. Her committee praised its thoroughness, but suggested she omit the chapter on the Whitmore files. The material, they explained, was tangential to her central argument and potentially distracting. She agreed to the revision. The chapter was never published. Today, the 43 intake forms remain in storage, their signatures still unexplained. The medical license issued to Elias Whitmore in 1881 still exists in New York state records, though the death certificate that once accompanied his file has never been relocated. And somewhere in the archives of the Brattleboro Retreat, in a folder that has not been opened in decades, there is a photograph, a staff portrait from 1881 taken in front of the main building on an autumn afternoon. The photograph shows 17 individuals, doctors, nurses, and administrative staff arranged in 2 rows. Each person in the image has been identified by handwritten notations on the back of the frame. 16 of the names correspond to documented employees. The 17th notation, written in handwriting that matches no known staff member, reads simply, E. Whitmore, M.D. The figure in the photograph stands at the far right of the back row, partially obscured by shadow. His features are indistinct, blurred in a way that suggests movement during the long exposure required by cameras of that era. He appears to be looking not at the camera, but at something beyond it, something, perhaps, that had not yet arrived. The room knew what the sky had forgotten. The Vermont State Hospital for the Insane opened in 1891 on a broad campus in Waterbury, where the Winooski River curves through a valley flanked by the Green Mountains. The original structure was a Kirkbride plan building, a style of psychiatric hospital architecture that emphasized long, sprawling wings designed to maximize natural light and air circulation. The main building stretched nearly 800 feet across landscaped grounds, its red brick facade and granite trim lending it the appearance of a grand estate rather than an institution for the mentally ill. Waterbury itself was a modest community, its economy built on lumber mills and dairy farms. The hospital quickly became the town's largest employer, and for more than a century, the two existed in quiet symbiosis. The town providing workers and supplies, the hospital providing steady wages, and an ever-present reminder that certain kinds of suffering were best kept behind closed doors. The facility expanded over the decades, adding new wings, outbuildings, and auxiliary structures. By the mid-20th century, the campus housed more than 1,500 patients and employed nearly 1,000 staff members. But as psychiatric care evolved and institutional populations declined, the hospital's footprint began to contract. Buildings were closed, then abandoned, then left to deteriorate. By 2011, only a small portion of the original campus remained in active use. The rest, including the original 1891 structure, stood empty, its windows darkened, its corridors silent, its basement flooded with decades of accumulated groundwater. That year, Tropical Storm Irene struck Vermont with unprecedented force, causing catastrophic flooding throughout the Winooski River Valley. The abandoned hospital buildings sustained severe damage. The state, already planning to redevelop the site, accelerated its timeline for demolition. It was during this process that workers discovered the room that should not have existed. The demolition crew arrived in October 2011, 2 months after the floodwaters had receded. Their task was to gut the original 1891 building in preparation for controlled demolition, removing hazardous materials, salvaging architectural elements of historical value, and documenting the structure's condition for state records. The crew chief, a man named Donald Farnsworth, who had worked in construction and demolition for 31 years, later described the project as routine. Old buildings are old buildings, he said in a 2014 interview with a Vermont Public Radio reporter. You go in expecting surprises, hidden rooms, weird modifications, stuff that doesn't match the blueprints. That's just how it is with these old state buildings. Plans got lost, additions got made, nobody kept track. The basement presented particular challenges. Decades of water infiltration had damaged the lower levels, and the post-Irene flooding had left standing water in several sections. Workers pumped out the water over a period of 3 weeks, gradually revealing the basement's layout. A maze of storage rooms, mechanical spaces, and corridors that connected the building's various wings. On November 9, 2011, a worker named Miguel Santana was conducting a routine inspection of the northwest corner of the basement when he noticed something unusual. A section of wall approximately 12 feet wide did not match the surrounding brickwork. The bricks were the same color and size, but the mortar was different. Older, he thought, though he couldn't explain how he knew this. Santana reported the anomaly to Farnsworth, who authorized an exploratory breach. Workers removed a section of bricks and discovered a doorway that had been sealed, apparently for many decades. Beyond the doorway was a room approximately 15 feet square, with a low ceiling and no windows. The room was empty except for a wooden chair positioned in the exact center of the floor, and the room was cold. The temperature differential was immediately apparent. While the rest of the basement maintained a steady 54 degrees, typical for underground spaces in Vermont during November, the sealed room registered at 31 degrees on the workers' handheld thermometer. Frost had formed on the interior walls. "I thought we'd hit some kind of cold pocket," Farnsworth recalled. "Old buildings sometimes have weird thermal properties, stone foundations, underground springs, that kind of thing, but this was different. This was like walking into a freezer." The workers also noted that the room felt damp in a way that contradicted its temperature. Cold air typically holds less moisture, yet the sealed room had a humidity level that seemed inconsistent with its freezing conditions. One worker described the sensation as walking into a cloud that was somehow also frozen. Farnsworth ordered the room documented and sealed until environmental specialists could assess whether it posed any hazard. But over the following days, workers passing the breached doorway reported that the room's conditions seemed to change. Sometimes it was cold, sometimes it was mild, sometimes the air felt thick with humidity, other times it was bone dry. The fluctuations made no sense. The room was underground, sealed from external conditions, isolated from the building's defunct HVAC system. There was no mechanism by which its temperature or humidity could vary. On November 14th, Farnsworth began keeping a log. The log documented 17 separate measurements taken over a period of 9 days. Each entry recorded the date, time, temperature, and estimated humidity level inside the sealed room. Farnsworth also noted the current external weather conditions for comparison. The first several entries showed no correlation. On November 14th, the room was 41 degrees and moderately humid. Outside, it was 53 degrees and overcast. On November 15th, the room was 28 degrees with frost on the walls. Outside, it was 49 degrees with light rain. But on November 17th, a retired history teacher named Barbara Aldrich visited the site as part of a historical documentation project sponsored by the Waterbury Historical Society. Aldrich was photographing architectural details when she overheard workers discussing the strange room. Curious, she asked to see Farnsworth's log. After examining the entries, Aldrich made a suggestion that would transform the investigation. She asked Farnsworth to compare his measurements not to current weather conditions, but to historical weather data from exactly 100 years earlier. Farnsworth was skeptical, but agreed to the experiment. Aldrich contacted the National Weather Service office in Burlington, which maintained historical records dating back to the late 19th century. Within 2 days, she had obtained weather data for Waterbury, covering November 1891 through November 1911. The correlation was exact. On November 14, 2011, the sealed room had registered 41 degrees with moderate humidity. On November 14, 1911, Waterbury had experienced temperatures of 41 degrees with moderate humidity. On November 15, 2011, the room had been 28 degrees with frost. On November 15, 1911, a cold snap had brought temperatures of 28 degrees with frost warnings. Every measurement in Farnsworth's log matched the historical weather conditions from exactly 100 years prior. The room was not responding to current conditions. It was responding to conditions that had occurred a century ago. Aldrich's findings attracted the attention of Dr. Helen Vasiliev, a climatologist at the University of Vermont who specialized in historical weather pattern reconstruction. Vasiliev visited the site on November 21st, bringing portable temperature and humidity sensors capable of continuous data logging. Her equipment confirmed what Farnsworth's manual measurements had suggested. Over a 48-hour monitoring period, the sealed room's internal conditions tracked precisely with weather records from November 21st and 22nd, 1911. When a warm front had passed through Waterbury in 1911, the room's temperature rose. When rain had fallen a century ago, the room's humidity increased. The correlation coefficient was essentially perfect, Vasiliev wrote, in a preliminary report submitted to the university's Department of Geography. I have no explanation for this phenomenon. The room appears to be maintaining atmospheric conditions that correspond to a fixed temporal offset of exactly 100 years. I am not aware of any physical mechanism that could produce such an effect. Vasiliev requested permission to continue monitoring the room and to conduct additional tests, including core samples of the walls and analysis of the room's construction materials. Her request was denied by the state agency overseeing the demolition project, which cited safety concerns and scheduling constraints. On November 26, 2011, workers were ordered to fill the sealed room with concrete. The decision to entomb the room came from the state's Department of Buildings and General Services, which managed the hospital demolition project. No official explanation was provided for the accelerated timeline. Internal communications obtained through a 2016 Freedom of Information Act request reveal only that the anomalous basement space had been designated a structural priority requiring immediate remediation. Farnsworth supervised the concrete pour personally. His crew worked through the night of November 26th, pumping approximately 40 cubic yards of concrete into the sealed room. The process took nearly 7 hours. In his 2014 interview, Farnsworth described the experience as deeply unsettling. The whole time we were pouring, the temperature in that room kept changing, he said. It was like the room knew what we were doing, like it was trying to, respond somehow. At one point, the humidity spiked so high that water started condensing on our equipment. Then it dropped to almost nothing. Then it got so cold I could see my breath, even though we were pumping in concrete that should have been raising the temperature. By dawn on November 27th, the room was completely filled. Workers sealed the doorway with fresh brickwork, matching the original masonry as closely as possible. The demolition project resumed according to schedule, but Farnsworth refused to sign the completion certificate for the basement phase of the work. His stated reason, documented in project files, was unresolved structural concerns. He retired from construction work 6 months later and declined all subsequent interview requests until his conversation with Vermont Public Radio in 2014. "I've torn down a lot of buildings," he said at the end of that interview. "I've seen a lot of strange things, but I've never seen anything like that room. And I've never wanted to see anything like it again." The original 1891 building of the Vermont State Hospital was demolished in 2012. The site has since been redeveloped as part of the Waterbury State Office Complex, housing various state agencies in modern structures built atop the old foundations. The concrete-filled room remains beneath the new construction, its location documented only in demolition records that have been sealed as part of an ongoing environmental remediation file. Dr. Vasiliev's preliminary report was never followed by a formal study. She left the University of Vermont in 2013 for a position at a research institution in British Columbia and has not publicly discussed the Waterbury anomaly since. Barbara Aldrich, the historian who first identified the temporal correlation, continued researching the hospital's history until her death in 2019. Her personal papers, donated to the Waterbury Historical Society, include extensive notes on the sealed room, including a detail she never shared publicly. In 1911, the year whose weather the room appeared to remember, the Vermont State Hospital had experienced an unusual incident. On November 26th of that year, exactly 100 years before the room was filled with concrete, a patient had disappeared from the facility's basement during a severe cold snap. The patient, a woman named Eleanor Marsh, had been admitted 3 months earlier for what her records described as confusion regarding the passage of time. She was last seen entering the northwest section of the basement, reportedly searching for a room she insisted existed, but that no staff member could locate. Her body was never found. Her file was closed in December 1911 with a final notation: patient presumed deceased. Circumstances unknown. Aldrich's notes end with a single question, written in the margin of her last page of research. Was she looking for the room, or was the room looking for her? The question remains unanswered. Beneath the modern office buildings of Waterbury, buried under 40 cubic yards of concrete, a space that should not exist continues to hold conditions that match a day 100 years gone, a day when the temperature dropped below freezing, when frost formed on windows throughout the valley, and when a woman walked into a basement searching for something she could not name. The weather has changed 1,000 times since then, but the room, perhaps, still remembers. He drew the same lines for 5 years, and no one thought to ask what he was counting. The Week School opened in 1865 on a hillside overlooking Vergennes, Vermont, a small city perched above the falls of Otter Creek, where the waterway widens toward Lake Champlain. Originally named the Vermont Reform School, the institution was established to house juvenile offenders, boys deemed too troubled for ordinary schooling, but too young for adult incarceration. The name changed in 1910 to honor a former superintendent, but the facility's essential character remained unchanged, a place where difficult children were sent to be forgotten. Vergennes itself was Vermont's smallest city by area, a compact grid of streets surrounded by farmland and forest. The school occupied a campus at the town's northern edge, its main buildings constructed from local limestone quarried from the Champlain Valley. Behind the dormitories, the land sloped downward through an apple orchard before giving way to a dense stand of white pine that had been planted in the 1880s as a windbreak. Beyond the pines lay a meadow that had once been pasture land, its soil too rocky for cultivation. By the 1920s, the meadow had been largely abandoned, visited only occasionally by groundskeepers who mowed it twice a year to prevent the forest from reclaiming the open ground. It was this meadow, its contours, its boundaries, its hidden features, that a boy known only as Patient 447 drew obsessively for half a decade. The boy arrived at the Week School in September 1924, transferred from the Brandon Training School following what his records described as unmanageable behavioral disturbances. He was 11 years old. He had not spoken a word since the age of 4. His name, if he had ever been given one beyond the numerical designation in his file, does not appear in any surviving documentation. The transfer paperwork noted that patient 447 exhibited a single persistent behavior. He drew, constantly, compulsively, on any surface available to him. At Brandon, he had covered the walls of his room with charcoal marks, scratched patterns into wooden furniture with his fingernails, and traced shapes in the condensation on windows during cold mornings. The drawings were always the same, a roughly rectangular shape with irregular edges crossed by parallel lines that might have been paths or boundaries, clusters of small marks concentrated in specific areas, a series of depressions indicated by concentric circles, like topographic contour lines on a map. Staff at Brandon had interpreted the drawings as evidence of his mental deficiency, repetitive, meaningless behavior characteristic of his diagnosis. The week school's intake physician, Dr. Gerald Hutchinson, noted the behavior in his initial assessment, but assigned it no particular significance. Patient exhibits compulsive drawing behavior, Hutchinson wrote. Produces same image repeatedly. Image appears abstract, possibly geometric. No communicative intent apparent. Recommend standard supervision and work assignment. Patient 447 was assigned to the laundry detail, where he worked 6 hours daily, washing and folding linens for the school's 200 residents. In his remaining hours, he drew. He drew on the walls of his dormitory room until staff painted over his work. He drew on his bed sheets until they were confiscated and replaced with canvas that resisted his charcoal. He drew on the floor of the laundry building during his shifts, using soap residue and coal dust from the boiler room. He drew in the dirt of the exercise yard with sticks, with stones, with his bare fingers. Always the same image, always the same proportions, always the same clusters of marks in the same locations. The first person to take serious notice of patient 447's drawings was a young teacher named Miriam Colby, who joined the week school staff in January 1926. Colby had trained in progressive education methods at the University of Vermont and harbored unconventional ideas about the inner lives of children deemed unreachable by traditional approaches. She began documenting patient 447's drawings in a personal journal, making careful sketches of his work before it was erased or painted over. By March of that year, she had collected more than 40 reproductions. The consistency is remarkable, she wrote. I have compared drawings made weeks apart on different surfaces in different conditions. The proportions remain identical. The placement of internal features varies by less than I can measure with my available tools. Whatever this image represents, it is not random, it is not abstract. It is something specific, something patient 447 knows with absolute precision. Colby attempted to communicate with the boy, sitting with him during his drawing sessions and asking questions he could not or would not answer. She showed him photographs of various locations, the school campus, Vergennes, Lake Champlain, maps of Vermont, hoping he might indicate whether his drawing represented something real. He showed no reaction to any of the images except one, a topographic survey map of the Champlain Valley borrowed from the town clerk's office. When Colby placed this map before him, patient 447 stopped drawing. He stared at the document for nearly 10 minutes, his finger tracing the contour lines that indicated elevation changes. Then he returned to his work, drawing the same image he had always drawn, but faster now, with what Colby described as urgent intensity. She noted the reaction in her journal, but could not interpret its meaning. The topographic map depicted an area of more than 500 square miles. Nothing in it corresponded obviously to the boy's drawing. Colby left the week school in August 1927 to care for an ailing mother in Massachusetts. Her journal was packed away with her belongings and would not be examined again for 60 years. Patient 447 remained at the week school until 1929, when he was transferred to the Vermont State Hospital in Waterbury. His file noted that he had become increasingly agitated over the preceding months, his drawing behavior escalating to the point of self-injury. He had worn the skin of his fingertips raw from constant repetition. The transfer paperwork includes a final observation from Dr. Hutchinson. Patient's condition has deteriorated. Compulsive behavior now interferes with all other function. Recommend transfer to facility better equipped for intensive supervision. Patient 447's subsequent history is unclear. Vermont State Hospital records from the 1930s are incomplete, and no file matching his description has been located in surviving archives. He disappears from the documented record entirely after his transfer. But the meadow behind the week school remained. In 1933, 4 years after patient 447's departure, the school began using the meadow beyond the pine grove for a purpose that would not be officially acknowledged for more than half a century. Children who died at the facility from illness, accident, or causes that records do not specify were buried there in unmarked graves. The practice continued until 1957, when the state mandated that all institutional deaths be reported and deceased individuals interred in licensed cemeteries. By that time, an estimated 90 to 120 bodies had been buried in the meadow, their locations documented only in a ledger that the school superintendent maintained privately and that was destroyed in a 1963 fire. The burials were not discovered until 1986, when a construction project revealed human remains near the former Week School property. The discovery prompted a full archaeological survey of the site conducted over the summer of 1987 by a team from the University of Vermont. Ground-penetrating radar and systematic excavation revealed the extent of the unmarked cemetery, approximately 2 acres of disturbed soil containing graves arranged in rough rows, with concentrations of burials in specific areas. The survey team produced a detailed topographic map of the site, documenting the location of each grave, the contours of the land, and the features that distinguished the burial ground from the surrounding terrain. It was this map that caught the attention of a surveyor named Richard Okonkwo, who had been hired to assess the property's boundaries for a potential memorial project. Okonkwo was reviewing historical documents related to the Week School when he encountered Miriam Colby's journal, which had been donated to the Vermont Historical Society by her estate following her death in 1984. Okonkwo recognized the drawings immediately. Patient 447's obsessive image, the rectangular shape with irregular edges, the parallel lines, the clusters of small marks, the concentric circles indicating depressions, matched the 1987 survey map with what Okonkwo later described as impossible precision. The parallel lines corresponded to the rows of graves. The clusters of marks indicated areas of concentrated burials. The concentric circles matched depressions in the terrain where the soil had settled over decomposing remains. Patient 447 had drawn a map of a cemetery that did not exist during his lifetime. He had documented the location of graves that would not be dug until years after he was transferred away from the facility. He had known somehow where the bodies would be buried before the first child died. Okonkwo's discovery was reported to the state archaeologist's office, which conducted a formal comparison of Colby's journal sketches and the 1987 survey. The correlation was confirmed. Patient 447's drawings, created between 1924 and 1929, depicted a burial site that was not established until 1933 and not documented until 1987. The finding was included in a supplemental report to the Archaeological Survey, classified as anomalous historical documentation and filed without further investigation. The state archaeologist at the time, Dr. Frances Yamamoto, noted in her personal correspondence that she could not explain the correlation and did not wish to speculate on its implications. Attempts to trace patient 447's history before and after his time at the Week School yielded limited results. Brandon Training School records from the 1920s are fragmentary, and many files were destroyed during the facility's closure in 1993. Vermont State Hospital records from the relevant period were damaged in Tropical Storm Irene in 2011. What little documentation survives offers no explanation for how a non-verbal boy could have known the precise topography of a burial site years before it existed. Miriam Colby's journal, now held in the Vermont Historical Society's collection, contains one additional detail that researchers have found difficult to interpret. In her final entry concerning patient 447, dated July 1927, she described a moment when the boy paused in his drawing and looked directly at her. The only time, she wrote, that he ever made eye contact. He held my gaze for perhaps 5 seconds, Colby wrote. Then he returned to his work. But in that moment, I had the strangest conviction that he was not drawing something he had seen. He was drawing something he was trying to prevent us from forgetting, something that had not happened yet, but that he knew with absolute certainty would happen. The meadow behind the former Week School is now a memorial site maintained by the Vermont Department of Children and Families. Small granite markers installed in 2014 indicate the approximate locations of the unmarked graves. The exact number of individuals buried there remains unknown. The memorial includes a small information kiosk that describes the history of the site and the circumstances of its discovery. It does not mention patient 447. It does not mention the drawings. It does not mention that a child once mapped this place with desperate precision years before anyone was buried here. Some of the archaeologists who worked on the 1987 survey later recalled an unsettling detail they had not thought significant at the time. Several of the recovered remains, those buried in the earliest graves, dating to 1933 and 1934, showed evidence of attempts at identification. Small objects had been placed with the bodies, buttons, coins, fragments of paper that had long since decomposed. One grave, located in the northwest corner of the site, contained something different. Buried with the remains of a child estimated to be between 12 and 14 years old was a piece of slate approximately 6 inches square. Scratched into the surface of the slate was a drawing, a rectangular shape with irregular edges crossed by parallel lines marked with clusters of small dots, a map of the meadow, a map of the graves. The grave was dated to approximately 1934, 5 years after patient 447 was transferred to Waterbury. The remains have never been identified. The slate is held in the Vermont State Archives, cataloged but not displayed. Researchers who have examined it note that the drawing matches Miriam Colby's sketches exactly. The same proportions, the same features, the same impossible foreknowledge. Some maps show where we are, others show where we are going, and some perhaps show what will happen if no one remembers to look. The children could not hear the songs they were singing. The Austin School for the Deaf opened in 1812 on a wooded hillside in Brattleboro, Vermont, where the West River descends through a narrow valley before joining the Connecticut. It was among the first institutions in the United States dedicated to the education of deaf children, predating the more famous American School for the Deaf in Hartford by 5 years. The school's founders believed that deaf children could be taught to communicate, to learn trades, to become productive members of society. A progressive view for an era that often confined individuals with disabilities to almshouses or asylum wards. Brattleboro itself was a town of peculiar acoustics. The valley's geography created unusual sound properties. Conversations carried across unlikely distances, echoes lingered longer than they should, and certain locations seemed to amplify or absorb sound in ways that defied simple explanation. Early settlers had noted these phenomena, attributing them to the river's course or the surrounding hills. The Austin School's founders considered the location ideal precisely because its students would be unaffected by such distractions. The campus grew over the following century, adding dormitories, workshops, and a small chapel constructed in 1879 from locally quarried granite. The chapel seated approximately 100 and was used primarily for weekly assemblies and holiday observances. Services were conducted in sign language, hymns translated into visual rhythms that students could follow through synchronized movement. No music was ever performed in the chapel. The students could not hear it. The staff saw no purpose in it, and yet something sang there. The discovery began with a maintenance survey conducted in August 1956. The Austin School, like many aging institutions, required periodic structural assessments, and the state had contracted an engineering firm from Burlington to evaluate the chapel's foundation and roof supports. The survey team arrived on August 7th, during the school's summer recess when the campus was largely deserted. Standard practice for such surveys included audio documentation. Engineers would record ambient sound while conducting their visual inspections, noting any unusual creaking, settling, or structural noises that might indicate problems invisible to the eye. The technology was rudimentary by modern standards: a portable reel-to-reel tape recorder, a single omnidirectional microphone, magnetic tape that captured frequencies between 50 and 12,000 hertz. The lead engineer, a man named Howard Lindgren, later described the survey as entirely routine. His team spent approximately 4 hours in the chapel, documenting the condition of support beams, examining the foundation for signs of water damage, and testing the stability of the bell tower that rose from the building's eastern end. The bell tower had not contained a functional bell since 1903, when the original bronze casting had cracked during an unusually cold winter. The school had never replaced it. A bell served no purpose for students who could not hear its ring. Lindgren's team completed their assessment and returned to Burlington. The audio tapes were filed with the written report and archived in the firm's record storage facility, where they remained undisturbed for nearly 3 decades. In 1983, the engineering firm was acquired by a larger company, and its historical records were transferred to a new facility in Montpelier. During the move, a clerk named Patricia Engel was tasked with cataloging and digitizing older audio materials. Most of the tapes contained nothing of interest: background noise, occasional verbal notes from engineers, the mundane sounds of buildings being measured and assessed. The Austin School tape was different. Engel's initial digitization captured approximately 3 hours of recording. The first 2 hours contained expected ambient sound, footsteps, voices, the scrape of equipment being moved. The final hour, however, recorded while the team was documenting the bell tower, contained something else. Beginning at approximately the 2-hour and 14-minute mark, the tape captured what Engel initially described as interference, a low, sustained tone that seemed to rise and fall in a pattern too regular to be random noise. The tone continued for approximately 47 minutes before the recording ended. Engel assumed the sound was equipment malfunction, or perhaps radio interference from a nearby broadcast station. But when she attempted to filter out the anomaly for archival purposes, she discovered that the tone was not a single frequency. It was multiple frequencies, layered and interwoven in a pattern that resisted simple analysis. She brought the tape to the attention of her supervisor, who contacted the University of Vermont's Department of Music and Acoustics. The analysis was conducted by a team of 4 acoustic engineers over a period of 6 weeks in the spring of 1984. Their findings, compiled in a technical report that was never formally published, described a phenomenon none of them could explain. The recorded sound consisted of at least 7 distinct vocal frequencies, harmonically related, but produced in a manner inconsistent with any known musical tradition. The frequencies corresponded to human vocal ranges: bass, baritone, tenor, alto, and soprano, but were arranged in intervals that did not match Western, Eastern, or any documented indigenous musical scale. More troubling was the coordination. Spectral analysis revealed that the voices, if they were voices, maintained perfect synchronization throughout the 47-minute recording. They breathed together. They shifted pitch together. They began and ended phrases at precisely the same moments. The level of coordination suggests either extensive rehearsal or some form of direct connection between the sound sources, the report noted. However, the acoustic properties of the recording indicate that the sources were distributed throughout the chapel space, not concentrated in a single location. The sound appears to originate from multiple points simultaneously. The engineers also noted that the frequencies included undertones below the range of normal human hearing, infrasonic components that would have been felt as vibration rather than heard as sound. These undertones pulsed in a rhythm that one analyst described as disturbingly biological, comparing it to a heartbeat or respiratory cycle. Dr. Samuel Oyalaran, a musicologist consulted during the analysis, attempted to match the harmonic patterns to known liturgical or folk traditions. His search encompassed Gregorian chant, Byzantine hymns, West African polyphony, Tibetan overtone singing, and dozens of other documented vocal practices. None matched. The patterns in the recording appeared to be unique. The most disturbing element of the analysis emerged when the team attempted to determine the number of individual voices present in the recording. Initial estimates suggested 7 distinct sources, but as analysis continued, that number grew to 12, then 20, then numbers that seemed impossible given the chapel's size and the recording's acoustic properties. The final report estimated a minimum of 47 simultaneous voices, though the true number could not be determined with certainty. Dr. Rebecca Lindqvist, who led the acoustic analysis, noted in her personal correspondence that the number troubled her. 47 voices in a chapel that seats 100, recorded during a period when school records confirm the building was empty. Where did they come from? Who was singing? And why 47, the same number as the minutes the recording lasted? Lindqvist also documented a phenomenon she hesitated to include in the official report. When the recording was played at sufficient volume, listeners reported physical sensations, pressure in the chest, a feeling of being watched, and, most consistently, an overwhelming urge to join in, to add their voice to the chorus, even though no melody was discernible. 3 members of her team experienced this sensation strongly enough that they asked to be removed from the project. 2 of them, Dr. Oyalaran and a graduate student named Thomas Whitfield, requested that their names be removed from the final report entirely. Their request was granted. The 4th team member, an audio technician named Janet Kowalczyk, completed her work on the project but declined to discuss it afterward. She left the university in 1985 and took a position at a recording studio in California. When contacted by a journalist researching the story in 2009, she responded with a single sentence: "Some sounds are not meant to be heard." The Austin School closed in 2014, its student population having declined as deaf education shifted toward mainstream integration. The campus was sold to a private developer, and most of the original buildings were demolished or converted for new purposes. The chapel still stands. It has been incorporated into a conference center that now occupies the site, its granite walls preserved as a historical feature. The space is used for corporate retreats and wedding receptions. Guests occasionally report unusual acoustics in the building, sounds that seem to come from nowhere, echoes that persist longer than they should, a sense that the space is somehow listening. The conference center's management attributes these reports to the building's age and unique construction. The original 1956 recording remains in the archives of the engineering firm that conducted the survey, now stored in a climate-controlled facility in Burlington. It has never been released publicly. Requests to access it for research purposes have been consistently denied, with the firm citing inconclusive provenance and potential copyright concerns. Dr. Rebecca Linkevist's personal papers, donated to the University of Vermont after her death in 2001, include a sealed envelope with instructions that it not be opened until 2056, 100 years after the original recording was made. The envelope's contents are unknown, but her final letter to a colleague, written in 1998, offers a glimpse of what she believed the recording contained. "I've spent 15 years trying to understand what we captured on that tape," she wrote. "I no longer believe we recorded something that was happening in that chapel. I believe we recorded something that had always been happening, something the building remembered, or perhaps something the building was waiting to share. The children who studied there could not hear it, but the building could. And when we placed a microphone in that space, we gave it a voice it had never had before." The Austin School's records, now held by the Vermont Department of Education, include a detail that researchers have found difficult to reconcile with the 1956 recording. In 1879, the year the chapel was constructed, 47 students were enrolled at the school, 47 children who could not hear, 47 voices in a recording made when no one was present, 47 minutes of singing in a chapel where music had never been performed. The harmonies continue, perhaps even now. Frequencies too low for human ears, vibrations absorbed by granite walls that have stood for nearly a century and a half. The children who made those sounds, if they made them, have been dead for generations. Their names appear in enrollment records, in graduation lists, in the small cemetery behind the campus where the earliest students were buried. But sound does not die the way people do. It diminishes, disperses, falls below the threshold of perception, but it never entirely disappears. It lingers in the materials that absorbed it, in the spaces that shaped it, in the silence that follows every note. The chapel still stands. The microphones have been removed. But some visitors, sitting alone in the pews during quiet afternoons, report a sensation they struggle to describe. A feeling that the room is full, that voices are rising all around them, that somewhere, just beyond the edge of hearing, a choir is singing songs in a language that was never meant for human ears. They listen for a moment, and then they leave, walking quickly, not looking back. Some sounds, after all, are not meant to be heard, and some silences are not really silent at all. They dreamed of a house that had been ash for 80 years. The Emily Proctor Memorial Hospital opened in 1923 on a hillside outside Proctor, Vermont, a small town that had grown wealthy from its marble quarries. The hospital was named for the wife of Redfield Proctor, Jr., a senator's son who had inherited both the quarrying business and his family's sense of civic obligation. When Emily died of tuberculosis in 1921, her husband commissioned the hospital as a memorial, a facility dedicated to treating the disease that had taken her. Proctor itself was a company town in all but name. The Vermont Marble Company owned the quarries, employed most of the residents, and shaped the community's character in ways both visible and invisible. The hospital sat on land donated by the company, its walls constructed from the same white marble that had made the Proctor family fortune. From a distance, the building appeared to glow against the green hills, a beacon of hope for the consumptive patients who arrived seeking clean air and modern treatment. The tuberculosis ward occupied the hospital's western wing, where large windows faced the mountains and patients could be wheeled onto balconies to breathe the restorative Vermont air. The eastern wing housed general medical patients, surgical recovery rooms, and, on the ground floor, a small psychiatric observation unit established in 1929 to serve patients whose physical illnesses were complicated by mental disturbance. Room 112 was located at the end of this unit, a private room with a single window overlooking the hospital's rear grounds. The window faced east toward a meadow that had once been farmland before the Marble Company purchased the surrounding acreage. The room was unremarkable in every measurable way. Its dimensions matched the other private rooms. Its furnishings were identical. Its ventilation, lighting, and plumbing conformed to standard specifications. But something in room 112 was different. The first documented incident occurred in March 1931, when a patient named Dolores Whitfield was admitted for observation following a suicide attempt. Whitfield was 53 years old, a former schoolteacher from Rutland, who had fallen into severe depression following the death of her husband. She had no history of psychotic symptoms, no family history of mental illness, and no documented connection to Proctor or its surrounding communities. Within 3 nights of her admission to room 112, Whitfield began reporting vivid dreams of a farmhouse she had never visited. The attending physician, Dr. Arthur Pemberton, noted her descriptions in detail. The farmhouse was 2 stories, painted white, with a red barn visible through the kitchen window. The kitchen had a cast-iron stove, a pine table with 4 chairs, and a ceramic pitcher painted with blue flowers that sat on a shelf above the wash basin. The upstairs contained 3 bedrooms, a master bedroom facing east, a smaller room for children, and a narrow chamber at the end of the hall that was always locked. Whitfield described these details with remarkable consistency across multiple interviews. She could not explain how she knew these things. She insisted she had never seen the farmhouse before her admission, yet she spoke of it with the familiarity of someone describing her childhood home. Dr. Pemberton attributed the dreams to her grief and her unfamiliar surroundings. He prescribed mild sedatives and documented the case as an example of displacement, the mind creating a comforting fictional space to escape unbearable reality. But 6 months later, another patient began dreaming of the same house. Harold Greenwood was a 41-year-old quarry worker admitted to room 112 in September 1931 following a workplace accident that had left him with chronic pain and what the hospital termed nervous exhaustion. Like Whitfield, he had no psychiatric history and no connection to the hospital's location beyond his employment at the Marble Company. Within 4 days, Greenwood reported dreams of a white farmhouse with a red barn. He described the kitchen in terms nearly identical to Whitfield's account: the cast-iron stove, the pine table, the ceramic pitcher with blue flowers. He added details Whitfield had not mentioned: a clock on the parlor mantel that struck the hours with a peculiar double chime, and a smell of lavender that seemed to permeate the upstairs hallway. Dr. Pemberton, disturbed by the similarities, reviewed both patients' files and found no points of contact. They had not shared a ward, had not been treated by the same nurses, and, as far as records indicated, had never exchanged a single word. Over the following 2 years, Pemberton documented 7 additional patients who, upon admission to room 112, began dreaming of the same farmhouse. Their ages ranged from 19 to 74. Their diagnoses included tuberculosis, pneumonia, surgical recovery, and various forms of nervous complaint. They came from towns across Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. Each described the house in consistent detail. Each reported the dreams beginning within the first week of their stay. And each, when questioned, insisted they had never seen or heard of the place before. In the autumn of 1933, Pemberton began researching the history of the land on which the hospital stood. Town records in Proctor were fragmentary. The community had grown so rapidly during the marble boom that careful documentation had often been neglected. But the Rutland County Clerk's office maintained older deeds and surveys. The hospital grounds, he discovered, had once been part of a larger property known as the Thatcher Farm. The farm had been established in 1809 by a family who had migrated from Connecticut following the Revolutionary War. The Thatchers had worked the land for nearly 4 decades, raising cattle and growing hay for the dairy farms that dotted the Otter Creek Valley. In 1847, the farmhouse had burned to the ground. The fire, which occurred during a January cold snap, had killed all 5 members of the family. Josiah Thatcher, his wife Margaret, their 2 young daughters, and an elderly aunt who had been living with them since her own husband's death. The cause of the fire was never determined. Local legend attributed it to a toppled lantern, though some accounts suggested the family had been overcome by illness before the flames began. That the fire had been a mercy that spared them a slower death. The land had passed through several owners before the Marble Company acquired it in 1904. No structure had been built on the exact site of the Thatcher farmhouse. The hospital, constructed 19 years later, occupied adjacent ground, its eastern wing extending to within 200 feet of where the farmhouse had once stood. Room 112 was the closest point in the building to that vanished location. Pemberton's research might have ended there, an interesting historical footnote, nothing more, had he not made an inquiry to the Vermont Historical Society about the Thatcher family. The Society's response, dated December 19, 1933, informed him that the Thatcher family papers had been preserved by a distant relative and were held in a private collection in Boston. The papers included household inventories, correspondence, and, most significantly, the personal diaries of Margaret Thatcher, maintained from 1839 until her death 8 years later. Pemberton wrote to the collection's owner, a retired physician named Dr. William Hastings, who had inherited the papers through his wife's family. Hastings agreed to allow Pemberton to examine the diaries, provided he traveled to Boston personally. The materials, Hastings explained, had never been transcribed or published. They remained exactly as Margaret Thatcher had left them. Pemberton made the journey in February 1934. What he found in Margaret Thatcher's diaries left him, by his own later account, profoundly unsettled in ways I am not able to articulate. The diaries described the farmhouse in detail, the cast-iron stove, the pine table with 4 chairs, the ceramic pitcher painted with blue flowers. Margaret had received the pitcher as a wedding gift and had treasured it greatly. She mentioned the parlor clock that struck with a double chime, a family heirloom her husband had inherited from his father. She wrote of hanging lavender bundles in the upstairs hallway to freshen the air during long winters. Every detail the room 112 patients had described appeared in Margaret Thatcher's diaries, including one detail that Pemberton had not yet heard from any patient: the locked room at the end of the upstairs hall. Margaret's diary entries about the locked room were sparse and troubled. She referred to it only as the small chamber and noted that her husband had forbidden anyone to enter it. The room had been sealed since before their marriage, Josiah claimed, and contained nothing of importance. Margaret's entries suggest she accepted this explanation, though several passages hint at unease. "I dreamed again of the small chamber," she wrote in November 1844. "In my dream, the door stood open, and I could see a bed inside and a figure lying upon it, though I could not discern whether it was man or woman, living or dead. I woke with such a feeling of dread that I could not return to sleep until dawn." The diary's final entry, dated January 3, 1847, 4 days before the fire, contained only a single line: "The door is open now. I understand why it was locked." No explanation followed. No subsequent entries appeared. The family died 4 days later, and whatever Margaret had understood died with her. Pemberton returned to Proctor in a state of considerable agitation. He requested a meeting with the hospital's administrator and recommended that room 112 be closed to patient use pending further investigation. His recommendation was denied. The hospital was operating at capacity, and a private room could not be left vacant based on, as the administrator termed it, historical coincidence and impressionable patients. 2 months later, Pemberton was transferred to a facility in Massachusetts. His personnel file notes only that the transfer was by mutual agreement and provides no forwarding address. He does not appear in subsequent Vermont medical directories and attempts by later researchers to trace his career have been unsuccessful. Room 112 remained in use until 1954, when the Emily Proctor Memorial Hospital closed its psychiatric observation unit due to declining admissions. During that 23-year period, an additional 31 patients reported dreams of the Thatcher farmhouse. Their accounts were documented by various staff members, though never with the systematic attention Pemberton had applied. Most physicians dismissed the dreams as coincidental anxiety responses, noting that sick patients often dreamed of idealized domestic spaces as a form of psychological retreat. The consistency of the details was attributed to the power of suggestion. Patients might have overheard others describing similar dreams or absorbed details from the room's atmosphere in ways that escaped conscious awareness. But the accounts persisted, and they continued to include details that no living person should have known. In 1947, a patient named Constance Barbieri described a dream in which she stood in the locked room at the end of the upstairs hall. She reported seeing a narrow bed, a wooden cradle, and a window covered with heavy curtains. In the cradle, she said, lay a child who was neither sleeping nor awake, but somewhere in between. Margaret Thatcher's diaries make no mention of a cradle. But a household inventory taken after the fire, a document Pemberton had not seen during his Boston visit, and that was not discovered until 1989, lists among the destroyed furnishings one pine cradle stored in the small upstairs chamber. The inventory was compiled by a town assessor 5 months after the fire. It had been filed in the Rutland County Clerk's office and never examined in connection with the hospital's history. Constance Barbieri had no way of knowing what was in that room, yet she described it exactly. The Emily Proctor Memorial Hospital was converted to a nursing home in 1962, and Room 112 became a residential suite for long-term care patients. The dreams reportedly ceased, or if they continued, no one thought to document them. The building was demolished in 1991 to make way for a modern medical complex. The site of the Thatcher farmhouse, now beneath a parking lot, bears no marker or memorial. The family is buried in a small cemetery 3 miles north of Proctor, their graves tended by the local historical society. Margaret Thatcher's diaries remain in private hands. Dr. William Hastings died in 1951, and the collection passed to his daughter, who declined all requests for scholarly access. The diaries have never been published, transcribed, or photographed. Yet the dreams they describe, the kitchen, the clock, the lavender in the hallway, the locked door at the end of the hall, were dreamed by strangers for more than 2 decades in a room that stood 200 feet from where Margaret Thatcher herself had dreamed them nearly a century before. Some places hold memories. Some rooms inherit what they cannot possibly know. And some doors, once opened, remain open forever. In the minds of those who sleep nearby, in the diaries of those who died too soon, in the silence of a house that burned 80 years before anyone dreamed of building a hospital on the land where it once stood. The door is open now. Perhaps it always was. The building carried something that wasn't supposed to be there. The Vermont State School occupied a sprawling campus outside the town of Vergènes, where the Otter Creek widens before emptying into Lake Champlain. Originally established as the Vermont Reform School in 1865, the institution had undergone several name changes and mission shifts over its century of operation. By the 1960s, it served as a residential facility for children and adults with developmental disabilities, a population that had grown steadily as Vermont consolidated its institutional care into fewer, larger facilities. Vergènes was Vermont's smallest city, a compact grid of streets surrounded by dairy farms and apple orchards. The school sat at the northern edge of town, its brick buildings visible from the main road that connected Vergènes to Burlington. The campus had expanded haphazardly over the decades, with new structures added as funding allowed and old ones repurposed as needs changed. The West Wing had been constructed in 1908 to house the facility's growing population of male residents. It was a three-story structure of red brick and timber framing, designed in the institutional style common to the era. Long corridors, high ceilings, and rows of windows that provided natural light, but offered little view of the outside world. The wing contained dormitory rooms, common areas, and a basement that had originally served as a workshop, but had been converted to storage by the 1930s. For nearly 6 decades, the West Wing functioned without incident. It housed hundreds of residents over the years, witnessed countless arrivals and departures, and accumulated the ordinary wear of institutional use. Nothing in its history suggested anything unusual, until the engineers came to weigh it. The 1967 safety assessment was mandated by the state following a series of structural failures at other Vermont institutions. Aging buildings across the state had shown signs of deterioration, settling foundations, compromised load-bearing walls, inadequate fire safety systems, and the legislature had allocated funds for comprehensive evaluations of all state-owned facilities. The engineering firm contracted for the Vermont State School Assessment was Hartwell Associates, a Burlington company that had conducted similar work for state agencies since the 1940s. The team assigned to the project consisted of 4 engineers led by Gerald Montague, a structural specialist with 23 years of experience. Standard assessment protocol required engineers to calculate the theoretical weight of each building based on architectural specifications and material inventories, then compare these calculations to observed structural stress patterns. Significant discrepancies could indicate hidden damage, unauthorized modifications, or construction defects that might compromise the building's integrity. The assessment of the West Wing began on September 11, 1967. Montague's team spent 3 days reviewing original blueprints, examining the building's construction, and taking measurements throughout the structure. Their calculations, based on the documented materials, brick, timber, plaster, glass, and standard furnishings, produced an expected weight of approximately 480,000 pounds. The stress analysis told a different story. Load-bearing walls showed compression patterns consistent with a weight significantly greater than 480,000 pounds. Foundation settling exceeded what the documented mass should have produced. Support beams exhibited strain that suggested they were carrying far more than they had been designed to hold. Montague ordered additional measurements. His team used calibrated instruments to assess stress patterns at multiple points throughout the structure. They examined the basement for hidden materials, stockpiled equipment, forgotten storage, anything that might account for unexpected mass. They found nothing. Yet the building continued to weigh more than it should. The final calculation, documented in Hartwell Associates' assessment report, dated October 3, 1967, estimated the West Wing's actual weight at approximately 492,000 pounds, roughly 12,000 pounds more than the documented materials could account for. 12,000 pounds, 6 tons. The equivalent of 3 automobiles or 40 adult human beings, or approximately 6,000 bricks that appeared in no inventory and could not be located within the structure. Montague's report noted the discrepancy but offered no explanation. The source of the additional mass remains undetermined, he wrote. Visual inspection and material sampling have revealed no hidden chambers, undocumented construction materials, or other factors that would account for the observed weight differential. The structural implications are minimal. The building's design includes adequate safety margins, but the anomaly warrants documentation for future reference. The report was filed with the state's Department of Buildings and General Services and promptly forgotten. The West Wing was deemed structurally sound and no further investigation was authorized. But Montague did not forget. His personal papers, donated to the University of Vermont's special collections after his death in 1994, reveal that he continued to puzzle over the discrepancy for years afterward. "I have reviewed the calculations repeatedly," he wrote in a 1972 letter to a colleague. "I have consulted with other engineers, examined similar structures, and researched historical construction practices. I can find no explanation for the additional 12,000 pounds. Buildings do not simply acquire mass. Matter does not appear from nothing. Yet the West Wing carries weight that has no documented source." In 1979, the Vermont State School underwent another round of assessments as the state considered renovating or replacing its aging facilities. A different engineering firm, Blackwood and Associates of Montpelier, was contracted for the evaluation. Their findings confirmed Montague's earlier observations. The West Wing's structural stress patterns indicated a mass approximately 12,000 pounds greater than its documented materials. The discrepancy had not changed in 12 years. The Blackwood report was more detailed than its predecessor, documenting the precise locations where excess stress was concentrated. The highest readings appeared in the basement, particularly in the northwest corner, where a section of wall had been bricked over sometime before 1930, according to the building's maintenance records. Engineers requested permission to open the sealed section and examine what lay behind it. The request was denied by the school's administration, which cited budget constraints and the minimal safety implications of the anomaly. "The building has stood for 70 years, the administrator wrote in his response. "Whatever accounts for the weight differential, it has not compromised the structure's integrity. We see no justification for invasive investigation." The sealed section remained unopened. The weight remained unexplained. By the late 1980s, the Vermont State School had become the subject of increasing scrutiny. Reports of neglect and abuse had surfaced, prompting investigations by state agencies and advocacy groups. The institution's population had declined sharply as Vermont shifted toward community-based care for individuals with disabilities, and the aging campus required expensive repairs that the state was reluctant to fund. In 1991, the decision was made to close the facility permanently. Residents were transferred to group homes and smaller institutions throughout the state. Staff were reassigned or laid off. The campus was fenced off and left to await demolition. The West Wing was scheduled for demolition in the summer of 1993. The contract was awarded to a Rutland company, Morrison Demolition, whose crew arrived on site in June of that year. Standard demolition protocol required detailed documentation of debris removal, weights recorded, materials categorized, disposal verified. The process served both regulatory and practical purposes, ensuring that hazardous materials were properly handled and that the site was fully cleared. Thomas Morrison, the company's owner, personally supervised the West Wing demolition. His crew worked through July, systematically dismantling the structure and loading debris into trucks for transport to a licensed disposal facility. Each truckload was weighed upon departure from the site and again upon arrival at the disposal facility. The totals were recorded in Morrison's project log. When the demolition was complete, Morrison calculated the final tally, approximately 480,000 pounds of debris, exactly what the original 1908 blueprints had predicted. The 12,000 pounds of unexplained weight had vanished. Morrison noted the discrepancy in his project documentation, but did not pursue it further. The demolition was complete, the site was cleared, and the state had accepted his final invoice. Whatever had added weight to the building for more than 8 decades was no longer his concern. But one detail from the demolition troubled him enough to mention it in a 1996 interview with a local historian researching the Vermont State School's history. When workers had finally breached the sealed section of the basement, the northwest corner that engineers had wanted to examine in 1979, They had found exactly what the building's maintenance records suggested: an empty storage space approximately 15 feet square with bare brick walls and a dirt floor. The space was unremarkable in every way except one. The dirt floor showed signs of disturbance. Not recent disturbance, the soil was packed and settled, suggesting it had been undisturbed for decades, but older disturbance, patterns that indicated the ground had been dug up and filled in again, perhaps multiple times, long before the section was sealed. Morrison's crew did not excavate the floor. Their contract specified building demolition, not archaeological investigation, and the state had expressed no interest in exploring the site's history. The sealed section was demolished along with the rest of the wing, its dirt floor covered by the rubble of the structure that had stood above it. The disposal facility that received the debris reported nothing unusual. The weight matched expectations. The materials were categorized and processed according to standard procedures. Whatever had made the West Wing heavy was gone. The Vermont State School campus was eventually cleared and redeveloped. Today, the site houses a small business park and a community recreation center. The West Wing's location is now occupied by a parking lot and a playground, its foundations buried beneath layers of gravel and asphalt. No marker indicates what once stood there. No plaque commemorates the residents who lived in the wing during its 85 years of operation. The building's records, intake logs, medical files, incident reports were transferred to the state archives in Montpelier, where they remain largely unexamined. But those records contain details that researchers have begun to piece together in recent years. The West Wing had housed male residents exclusively from 1908 to 1957, when the facility began integrating its population. During that period, the wing's official capacity was 112 residents. Census records from the same period show that the West Wing's actual population consistently exceeded its capacity, sometimes by significant margins. In 1923, 147 residents were documented in a space designed for 112. In 1931, the number reached 163. Death records for the facility are incomplete. Vermont did not require detailed reporting of institutional deaths until 1941, and many earlier records were lost in a 1963 fire at the State Health Department's storage facility. But fragmentary documentation suggests that mortality rates at the Vermont State School were significantly higher than at comparable institutions, particularly in the West Wing, and particularly during the winter months. The sealed section of the basement was bricked over in 1929. Maintenance records provide no explanation for this modification, noting only that the work was completed in November of that year by staff members whose names do not appear in any other institutional documentation. Gerald Montague's final letter on the subject, written in 1991, shortly before his death, offered no conclusions but posed a question that subsequent researchers have found difficult to dismiss. 12,000 pounds, he wrote. I have spent 24 years trying to account for 12,000 pounds of unexplained mass. I have considered every rational explanation, measurement error, documentation gaps, hidden construction materials. None suffice, he continued. Recently, I learned that the Vermont State School's historical records are being compiled for archival preservation. I requested access to death records from the West Wing's early decades. The archivist informed me that such records do not exist, or rather, that they exist only in fragments, covering certain years, but not others. The years for which records are missing correspond almost exactly to the period when the sealed basement section would have been accessible, before 1929, before the bricks went up. I am not suggesting anything improper. I am merely noting a coincidence. 12,000 pounds is the approximate weight of 40 adult human beings. The West Wing consistently housed more residents than its documented capacity. the death records for that period are incomplete. Some weights cannot be explained by the materials we can see, some burdens are carried in silence, documented nowhere, visible only in the stress they leave behind. The letter ends there. Montague died 3 months later. The West Wing had already been demolished, and its weight, all 480,000 documented pounds of it, had been carted away to a disposal facility, cataloged, and buried, exactly as the blueprints had always said it should be. No more, no less, as if the 12,000 pounds had never existed at all. The dead kept writing, and no one knew how to make them stop. Brattleboro Memorial Hospital opened in 1923 on a hillside overlooking the Connecticut River, where the town of Brattleboro had grown into southeastern Vermont's largest commercial center. The hospital served a region that stretched from the Massachusetts border to the Central Green Mountains, providing general medical care, surgical services, and, in a dedicated wing added in 1931, psychiatric treatment for patients whose conditions did not require the long-term commitment of the state asylum system. Brattleboro itself was a town of contradictions. Its downtown bustled with shops and restaurants that catered to tourists passing through on their way to ski resorts and summer retreats. Its outskirts held quieter histories. The Brattleboro Retreat, Vermont's oldest psychiatric institution, and a network of boarding houses that had once sheltered patients discharged from care but not yet ready to return to ordinary life. The hospital occupied a middle ground between these worlds. Its patients came from all walks of life: farmers injured in equipment accidents, factory workers sickened by industrial chemicals, elderly residents of the surrounding towns, and, in the psychiatric wing, individuals experiencing breakdowns that their families hoped would prove temporary. The mailroom was located in the hospital's basement, a windowless space where 2 clerks sorted incoming correspondence and prepared outgoing mail for pickup by the postal service. The work was routine, unglamorous, and essential. Patients depended on letters from family and friends to maintain their connection to the world beyond the hospital walls. For most of the hospital's history, the mailroom operated without incident. Then the letters began arriving for patients who were no longer alive to receive them. The first anomaly was noted in March 1958 by a mailroom clerk named Dorothy Hollenbeck. A letter had arrived addressed to a patient named Robert Sawyer, who had been admitted to the psychiatric wing 3 weeks earlier for treatment of severe depression. Sawyer had died by suicide on February 27th, 4 days before the letter's postmark. Hollenbeck flagged the letter for return to sender, noting the discrepancy in her daily log. Such incidents were not uncommon. Mail traveled slowly in rural Vermont, and families were not always promptly notified of a patient's death. A letter mailed before the sender learned of the death might easily arrive afterward. But over the following months, similar letters continued to arrive. By the end of 1958, Hollenbeck had logged 23 letters addressed to deceased patients. By the end of 1959, the number had reached 61. The hospital's administrator, Dr. Franklin Mercer, initially dismissed the pattern as statistical noise. The psychiatric wing treated hundreds of patients annually, and some percentage would inevitably die during or shortly after their stay. Delayed mail was a natural consequence of imperfect communication. But Hollenbeck, who had worked in the mailroom for 11 years, noticed details that troubled her. Not all the letters could be explained by communication delays. Some bore postmarks dated well after the patient's deaths, not days, but weeks. A few arrived months after the intended recipients had been buried. In January 1960, she began keeping a separate log, documenting every letter that arrived for a deceased patient, along with the date of death and the postmark date. The pattern she discovered would occupy postal inspectors, forensic analysts, and hospital administrators for more than a decade. By 1963, Hollenbeck's log contained 217 entries. Of these, 104 bore postmarks dated after the recipient's death. She brought her findings to Dr. Mercer, who reviewed the documentation with visible skepticism. Postmarks, he suggested, were not always reliable. Postal equipment malfunctioned. Dates were misread. The apparent anomalies likely reflected clerical errors rather than genuine impossibilities. But Hollenbeck had anticipated this objection. She had retained 37 of the anomalous letters, those whose intended recipients had no known family or whose families had declined to claim their belongings, and had examined them in detail. The letters were not form correspondence or advertising circulars. They were personal communications, handwritten on various types of stationery, discussing matters specific to the recipients' lives, family news, business concerns, expressions of hope for recovery. Several referenced events that had occurred after the patient's deaths: a wedding, a birth, a change in local weather, events the senders could not have known about at the time of the documented postmark if that postmark were incorrect. Dr. Mercer agreed to contact the United States Postal Service for clarification. His inquiry was assigned to a postal inspector named Vernon Ostrowski, who visited the hospital in April 1963 to examine the retained letters. Ostrowski's preliminary report, submitted to his supervisors in June of that year, confirmed that the postmarks appeared genuine. The stamps had been canceled by regulation equipment, the dates were legible and consistent with Postal Service records for the relevant facilities, and there was no evidence of tampering or forgery. The letters appear to have been mailed on the dates indicated, Ostrowski wrote. I can offer no explanation for how correspondence posted after a recipient's death could reference that recipient by name and discuss matters relevant to their life and hospitalization. The report was classified as inconclusive, and no further investigation was authorized. The letters continued to arrive. By 1967, Hollenbeck's log contained 512 entries. She had retired the previous year, but her successor, a young clerk named Miriam Delgado, continued the documentation at Hollenbeck's request. Delgado proved to be an even more meticulous observer than her predecessor. She began photographing the anomalous letters before returning them to sender or filing them with unclaimed patient belongings. She noted not only postmark dates but also return addresses, handwriting characteristics, and the specific content of each letter. In 1968, she made a discovery that transformed the investigation. A letter had arrived for a patient named Eleanor Vance, who had died in the psychiatric wing on August 14th of that year. The letter was postmarked August 22nd, 8 days after Vance's death, and bore a return address in Keene, New Hampshire. Delgado, following her standard procedure, contacted the Keene address to notify the sender of Vance's death. The woman who answered the telephone, Vance's sister, Ruth Brennan, expressed confusion. She had not written any letter on August 22nd. She had not written any letter since learning of her sister's death on August 15th. But when Delgado described the letter's contents, a discussion of their mother's declining health, a question about whether Eleanor had received the package Ruth had sent the previous week, Ruth Brennan fell silent. "Those are things I would have written," she said finally. "Those are exactly the things I would have said. But I didn't write that letter. I couldn't have. Eleanor was already gone." Delgado asked if Ruth could identify the handwriting. She sent a photocopy of the letter to Keene, and Ruth Brennan's response arrived 2 weeks later. "This is not my handwriting," she wrote. "This is Eleanor's." The revelation prompted a more systematic analysis. Delgado contacted the families of other deceased patients whose letters exhibited dating anomalies, requesting samples of both the patient's handwriting and the purported sender's handwriting for comparison. Over the following 3 years, she collected samples related to 89 anomalous letters. 47 families provided adequate comparison materials. Of these, 31 letters were determined by visual inspection and later by professional forensic analysis to have been written not by the listed senders, but by the deceased patients themselves. The patients had written letters to themselves, addressed to the hospital where they would die, postmarked after their deaths. The implications were impossible to process through any conventional framework. Dr. Mercer, confronted with Delgado's findings in 1971, ordered a comprehensive review of the hospital's mail records. He brought in outside consultants, a forensic document examiner from Boston, a postal service supervisor from the Brattleboro office, and a psychiatrist specializing in unusual phenomena. Their review, conducted over 6 months, confirmed the essential facts. The handwriting matches were genuine. The postmarks were authentic. The letters had been written, mailed, and delivered through normal postal channels. The consultants could not explain how deceased patients had written and mailed letters after their deaths. They could not explain how those letters had been postmarked by post offices that had no record of receiving them. They could not explain why the phenomenon was limited to Brattleboro Memorial Hospital, or why it had begun in 1958, or why it showed no sign of stopping. Their final report, submitted in February 1972, recommended that the matter be referred to federal authorities for further investigation. The recommendation was never implemented. On March 3, 1974, a pipe burst in the hospital's basement during an unusually cold night. The resulting flood damaged several storage areas, including the room where historical mail records were kept. The damage was extensive. Hollenbeck's original logs, Delgado's photographs, the retained letters, the forensic analyses, and the consultant's report were all destroyed. Water had penetrated the filing cabinets and remained standing for nearly 48 hours before the flooding was discovered. The hospital's other basement archives, financial records, personnel files, building maintenance logs, were stored in adjacent rooms. They emerged from the flood undamaged. Only the mail records, kept in a single storage room at the lowest point of the basement, were affected. The coincidence was noted but not investigated. Delgado resigned from the hospital 2 months later, citing personal reasons. She moved to California and declined all subsequent requests for interviews about her work at Brattleboro Memorial. Her personal copies of the documentation, if any existed, have never been located. Dorothy Hollenbeck died in 1979. Her estate contained no materials related to her mailroom observations. Vernon Ostrowski, the postal inspector, retired in 1976. His official files were archived according to standard procedures, but a 1983 records review found that his Brattleboro correspondence had been misfiled and could not be located. The paper trail, such as it was, had effectively vanished, but not entirely. In 1997, a graduate student at the University of Vermont named Christine Adeyemi was researching the history of mental health care in the Connecticut River Valley when she discovered a reference to the Brattleboro Memorial Mail anomalies in an obscure 1973 article published in a regional psychiatric journal. The article, written by one of the consultants who had reviewed Delgado's findings, described the phenomenon in general terms without naming the hospital or the individuals involved. It noted that a New England medical facility had experienced a sustained pattern of postal anomalies involving deceased psychiatric patients, and that forensic analysis had confirmed handwriting matches that defied conventional explanation. The author, Dr. Philip Nordstrom, had died in 1988, but Adeyemi located his widow, who had preserved his professional papers in their Connecticut home. Among those papers was a single item that had escaped the 1974 flood: a photocopy of one of the anomalous letters, along with Dr. Nordstrom's handwritten notes. The letter was addressed to a patient named Samuel Redfern, who had died at Brattleboro Memorial on October 17, 1969. The postmark was dated October 29th. The return address was listed as the home of Redfern's brother in Springfield, Massachusetts. Dr. Nordstrom's notes indicated that the brother had denied writing the letter and that forensic analysis had matched the handwriting to Samuel Redfern himself. The letter's contents were brief. "I am writing to tell you that I am well. The confusion has passed. I understand now what I could not understand before. Do not grieve for me. I am exactly where I am supposed to be." Adeyemi included the discovery in her dissertation, which was completed in 2000 and received limited academic attention. Brattleboro Memorial Hospital closed its psychiatric wing in 1987, consolidating those services with the Brattleboro Retreat. The building continues to operate as a general medical facility, its mailroom now handling a fraction of the correspondence it once processed. Current staff are unaware of the anomalies that occurred between 1958 and 1972. The institutional memory has faded, buried beneath decades of administrative turnover and the comprehensive destruction of the relevant records. But the United States Postal Service maintains archives that extend beyond any single institution's documentation. In 2015, a Freedom of Information Act request filed by an independent researcher yielded a fragment of Vernon Ostrowski's original 1963 report, a single page that had been misfiled rather than lost. The page contained a list of 11 letter recipients, their dates of death, and the postmark dates of letters that had arrived for them afterward. The discrepancies ranged from 3 days to 4 months. At the bottom of the page, in handwriting that archivists identified as Ostrowski's own, was a notation that had not appeared in any other surviving documentation. Interviewed Postmaster Whelan, Brattleboro office, April 14th. Whelan reports no memory of processing the letters in question, but notes that several clerks have mentioned unusual activity in the sorting room during early morning hours, letters appearing in bins that had been empty the previous evening. No formal reports filed. Whelan reluctant to discuss further. The notation was dated April 1963. No record of a Postmaster Whelan serving in Brattleboro during that period has been located in Postal Service personnel files. The sorting room Ostrowski referenced was demolished in 1978 when the Brattleboro Post Office relocated to a new facility, and the letters, 847 of them according to Hollenbeck's count, arriving over 14 years for patients who could not receive them, written in some cases by hands that had already stopped moving, have vanished into the silence that follows all unanswered questions. The dead wrote letters, the letters were delivered, and somewhere in the ordinary machinery of stamps and postmarks and sorting bins, something accepted those letters and carried them forward, as if death were merely a change of address, as if the boundary between sender and recipient had become, for a time, permeable in ways that no one was prepared to explain. The mailroom is quiet now, but mail still arrives at Brattleboro Memorial Hospital, and occasionally, rarely, a clerk will notice a letter addressed to a patient whose file has been closed, whose bed has been emptied, whose name appears only in records that no one has consulted in years. Standard procedure is to return such letters to sender. No one has thought to check the handwriting. The tape recorded things that happened before it existed. The Vermont State Hospital occupied a campus in Waterbury, where the Winooski River curves through a valley flanked by the Green Mountains. Founded in 1891 as the Vermont State Asylum for the Insane, the institution had grown over the following century into a sprawling complex of brick buildings, connected walkways, and manicured grounds that belied the suffering contained within its walls. By the mid-20th century, the hospital housed more than 1,500 patients and employed a staff of nearly 1,000, attendants, nurses, physicians, groundskeepers, cooks, and administrators who formed a self-contained community largely invisible to the outside world. Waterbury itself was a quiet town, its economy shaped by the hospital's presence. Generations of families worked at the facility, passing knowledge and employment from parent to child in an unbroken chain that stretched back to the institution's founding. The hospital was simply there, as permanent and unremarkable as the mountains themselves. Among those who spent their lives within its walls was an attendant named Harold Bergstrom, who began working at the Vermont State Hospital in 1941 and remained until his retirement in 1976. Bergstrom was born in Waterbury in 1915, the son of a dairy farmer whose land bordered the hospital's northern fence. He had grown up watching the institution from a distance, observing the patients who walked its grounds and the staff who came and went through its gates. By the time he joined the hospital's workforce at the age of 26, Bergstrom had already spent a lifetime in its shadow. He would spend another 35 years inside its walls. Harold Bergstrom died in February 1985, 1 year after his wife's passing from cancer. He left behind no children, no close relatives, and few possessions of value. His estate was managed by a nephew in New Hampshire who traveled to Waterbury in the spring of 1985 to sort through Bergstrom's belongings and prepare the house for sale. The nephew, a man named Kenneth Fitzgerald, found little of interest. Bergstrom had lived modestly, accumulating few luxuries over his decades of institutional employment. The house contained worn furniture, outdated appliances, and boxes of personal papers that Fitzgerald donated to a local historical society without examination. He did not discover the tape until 2003, when Bergstrom's house, which had been rented to various tenants since its sale in 1986, was finally demolished to make way for a condominium development. During the demolition, workers discovered a fireproof lockbox hidden beneath the floorboards of the bedroom closet. The lockbox was delivered to Fitzgerald, who had retained ownership of certain items from his uncle's estate. Inside was a single item, a magnetic audio cassette, labeled in Bergstrom's handwriting with the date, August 12, 1984, and the words, "For whoever finds this." Fitzgerald owned no cassette player and had little interest in his uncle's final message. The tape sat in a drawer for several months until his daughter, a graduate student in oral history at the University of New Hampshire, learned of its existence and asked to examine it. She played the tape for the first time on December 7, 2003. What she heard would occupy researchers, audio engineers, and archivists for years afterward. The recording began with Harold Bergstrom's voice, elderly, slightly hoarse, speaking in the measured cadence of someone who had rehearsed what he intended to say. He identified himself, stated the date, and explained that he was recording a confession of what he had witnessed during his years at the Vermont State Hospital. "I am 70 years old," he said. "I have kept silent for 40 years. I cannot keep silent any longer. What I am about to describe, I saw with my own eyes. What I am about to confess, I participated in with my own hands. I do not ask for forgiveness. I ask only to be believed." The narrative that followed documented conditions at the hospital during the 1940s and early 1950s, overcrowding, inadequate staffing, physical restraints used for convenience rather than necessity, medications administered without proper oversight, and deaths that were recorded as natural, but that Bergstrom described as preventable, even deliberate. His account was detailed and specific. He named patients, described incidents, identified colleagues who had participated in practices he now recognized as abusive. He spoke for approximately 5 hours, pausing occasionally to collect himself or to clarify a detail. The confession was disturbing but not, in itself, extraordinary. Similar accounts had emerged from former employees of Vermont's state institutions during investigations in the 1970s and 80s. Bergstrom's testimony, while valuable to historians, seemed to confirm what was already known rather than reveal new horrors. But the tape contained more than Bergstrom's confession. Fitzgerald's daughter, whose name was Rebecca, noticed the anomaly during her third listening of the recording. At approximately the 2-hour mark, Bergstrom's narrative was interrupted by a passage of different audio, sounds that did not match the rest of the tape. The interruption lasted approximately 12 minutes. It began abruptly, cutting off Bergstrom mid-sentence, and ended just as abruptly, with his voice resuming as if nothing had occurred. The audio in the interrupted segment was difficult to interpret. It contained voices, multiple speakers, their words overlapping and indistinct, along with ambient sounds that suggested an indoor space, footsteps on hard floors, the creak of doors, the clink of metal against metal. Rebecca, trained in oral history methodology, recognized the audio quality as inconsistent with 1984 recording technology. The interrupted segment sounded older, not degraded, but fundamentally different in its acoustic properties, as if recorded on equipment from an earlier era. She brought the tape to the university's audio preservation laboratory, where technicians examined it using spectral analysis and other diagnostic tools. Their findings were difficult to explain. The cassette tape itself was standard 1980s consumer equipment, a TD-KSA-90, manufactured in 1983, according to batch numbers printed on the housing. The magnetic coating was consistent with production specifications for that model and year. But the audio recorded on the tape told a different story. The majority of the recording, Bergstrom's confession, exhibited characteristics consistent with 1980s cassette technology: frequency response, noise floor, compression artifacts, and other markers that audio engineers use to date recordings. The interrupted segments, there were 3 in total, located at the 2-hour mark, the 4-hour mark, and the 5-hour and 40-minute mark, exhibited characteristics consistent with acoustic recording technology from the 1910s and 1920s. The frequency response was narrower, the dynamic range more limited, and the ambient noise profile matched the hiss and crackle of early electrical recording equipment that had been obsolete for 60 years before Bergstrom made his tape. The total duration of the anomalous segments was 47 minutes. 47 minutes of audio that could not have been recorded on the tape that contained it. The content of the anomalous segments proved even more troubling than their technical impossibility. Audio restoration specialists at the Library of Congress, who examined a digital copy of the tape in 2006, were able to enhance the interrupted segments sufficiently to transcribe portions of the dialogue. The voices belonged to adults speaking English with accents consistent with early 20th century New England. They discussed patients by number rather than name, referenced treatments and procedures that matched documented practices at the Vermont State Hospital during the 1910s and 20s, and mentioned specific buildings and locations on the hospital campus. One segment, lasting approximately 8 minutes, captured what appeared to be an admission interview. A male voice, likely a physician, questioned a new patient about his symptoms and history. The patient's responses were confused, fragmented, difficult to follow, but certain details were clear. The patient stated his age as 12 years old. He stated that his name was Harold. He stated that he had been brought to the hospital by his father, who believed he was experiencing fits that the family doctor could not explain. The interview concluded with the physician noting that the boy would be assigned to Ward 7 for observation and that his case would be reviewed in 30 days. Vermont State Hospital records from the 1920s are incomplete, but a partial census from November 1924 lists a patient in Ward 7 identified only as Harold B., age 12, observation. The patient was discharged in January 1925. No further details appear in surviving documentation. Harold Bergstrom was 9 years old in November 1924. He never mentioned being a patient at the hospital. His employment records, which began in 1941, contain no reference to prior admission. His confession tape, the portions recorded in his own voice in 1984, contains no reference to childhood hospitalization, but the tape itself contains the sound of a boy named Harold being admitted to the very institution where he would later spend 35 years as an attendant. The other anomalous segments proved equally disturbing. The 4-hour interruption captured what appeared to be a disciplinary proceeding, a patient being restrained and confined for violent behavior. The voices of staff members could be heard issuing commands, the sounds of struggle evident in the background. A child's voice, high and frightened, repeated the same phrase over and over, "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." The 5-hour and 40-minute interruption was the most difficult to interpret. It consisted primarily of ambient sound, footsteps, distant voices, the clatter of what might have been meal service, overlaid with what audio analysts described as sustained vocalization at the edge of audibility. When this segment was filtered and amplified, the vocalization resolved into a single voice, speaking in a barely audible whisper. The voice appeared to be reciting names, patient names. The same names Harold Bergstrom would mention in his 1984 confession, describing individuals he had known during his employment decades later. Names of patients who had died at the hospital in the 1940s and 50s. Names being whispered on a recording made, according to every technical analysis, sometime between 1919 and 1924. The tape raised questions that no investigator could answer. How could audio from the 1920s appear on a cassette tape manufactured in 1983? How could a boy's admission interview be captured on a recording made 60 years later by the man that boy had become? How could names unknown to anyone until the 1940s be whispered on a recording made 2 decades before those names had any significance? The Library of Congress analysts noted in their final report that the technical evidence is internally consistent but externally impossible. The anomalous segments bore all the hallmarks of authentic early 20th century audio recordings. The cassette tape bore all the hallmarks of authentic 1980s magnetic media. The two should not have been able to coexist on the same physical object. Yet they did. Kenneth Fitzgerald, informed of the findings, declined to pursue further investigation. He donated the original tape to the Vermont Historical Society in 2009, where it remains in climate-controlled storage. The Society has restricted access to the recording, citing preservation concerns and unresolved provenance questions. Researchers who have requested copies have been directed to the Library of Congress analysis, which is available in summary form, but from which the actual audio has been redacted. No one has heard the full tape since Rebecca Fitzgerald completed her initial documentation in 2004. She declined to discuss her findings publicly, and her graduate thesis, which was to have focused on oral histories of institutional care in Vermont, was never completed. Harold Bergstrom's confession, in the portions recorded in his own voice, provides no clues. He does not mention the anomalous segments. He does not acknowledge that anything unusual occurred during the recording process. He speaks for approximately 5 hours and 13 minutes, the tape's runtime minus the 47 minutes of impossible audio, and then falls silent. His final words on the recording are these: "I have said what I came to say. I have told the truth as I witnessed it. But there are things I witnessed that I do not remember witnessing. There are memories that do not feel like my own. Sometimes I wonder if I have been at this hospital longer than I know. Sometimes I wonder if I ever really left." The tape ends. The silence that follows is not empty. Audio analysis reveals that the final 3 seconds of the recording, after Bergstrom's voice has stopped, contain a faint sound that technicians have been unable to identify. Some have described it as breathing. Others have described it as the whisper of names continuing, too quiet to distinguish, as if someone were still speaking just beyond the range of the equipment's sensitivity. The tape was recorded on August 12, 1984. Harold Bergstrom died on February 3, 1985. But something on that tape was recorded long before he was born. And something perhaps continued recording long after he stopped speaking. The lockbox was fireproof. The floorboards were undisturbed for nearly 20 years. And the tape waited in the darkness beneath the bedroom where Harold Bergstrom slept his final nights, holding sounds that should not exist and voices that belonged to no documented timeline. Some confessions are spoken, others are remembered by machines that have no memory, and some truths are recorded in places where time itself has forgotten how to move in only one direction. They walked in their sleep to a place that would not be discovered for another century. The Brattleboro Retreat sits on a hillside in southeastern Vermont, where the West River descends through a narrow valley before joining the Connecticut. Founded in 1834 as Vermont's first institution dedicated to the treatment of mental illness, the retreat preceded the state asylum system by more than half a century. Its founders believed that peaceful surroundings and compassionate care could restore troubled minds, a progressive philosophy that attracted patients from across New England and established the facility's reputation as a place of genuine healing rather than mere confinement. The campus grew steadily through the 19th century, expanding from its original Georgian Revival building to include additional treatment wings, staff residences, and auxiliary structures. Behind the main buildings, the land sloped gently through an apple orchard before leveling into a broad meadow that had once been pasture land. The meadow stretched for approximately 12 acres, bordered by forest on 3 sides and by Retreat Brook on the 4th. Patients were encouraged to walk the grounds as part of their treatment, and the meadow became a popular destination, a quiet space where the troubled could find temporary peace beneath open skies. Staff accompanied ambulatory patients during daylight hours, guiding them along established paths and ensuring their safety. But some patients found their way to the meadow without guidance, without awareness, without any conscious intention at all. They walked in their sleep, and they walked to the same place again and again for more than a quarter century. The first documented incident occurred on the night of May 14, 1897. A female patient named Constance Whitmore, admitted 3 weeks earlier for what her records described as nervous exhaustion following bereavement, was found missing from her bed during a 2 o'clock check. A search of the building proved fruitless. At approximately 3:15 in the morning, a groundskeeper discovered her standing in the meadow behind the orchard, barefoot and wearing only her nightgown. Whitmore was unresponsive when approached. Her eyes were open but unfocused, and she did not react to her name or to physical contact. The groundskeeper, following protocol for patients found in a somnambulant state, gently guided her back toward the main building. She walked without resistance, still apparently asleep, and showed no memory of the incident when she woke the following morning. The attending physician, Dr. Edmund Hartley, noted the episode in Whitmore's file, but assigned it no particular significance. Sleepwalking was a recognized phenomenon, and patients experiencing emotional distress were known to exhibit various nocturnal disturbances. But 2 weeks later, another patient was found in the same location. Samuel Briggs, a 63-year-old merchant from Boston admitted for treatment of melancholia, was discovered standing in the meadow at approximately 2:45 in the morning. Like Whitmore, he was barefoot, unresponsive, and had no memory of leaving his bed. Like Whitmore, he had walked directly to a specific point in the meadow, not wandering, not exploring, but proceeding with apparent purpose to a precise location. The night attendant who found Briggs noted something unusual in her incident report. He was standing in exactly the same spot where Whitmore had been found 2 weeks earlier. Dr. Hartley, reviewing the reports, marked the location on a survey map of the retreat's grounds. He did not know why. He would later describe it as an instinct, nothing more. a sense that the coincidence warranted documentation. It was the beginning of a documentation effort that would span more than 2 decades. By the end of 1897, 7 patients had been found sleepwalking to the same location in the meadow. By 1900, the number had reached 23. By 1905, it had exceeded 50. The patients shared no common diagnosis. They ranged in age from 17 to 74. They came from Vermont, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, New York, and as far away as Pennsylvania. They had been admitted for conditions ranging from melancholia to hysteria to what physicians of the era termed dementia praecox. Yet each, at some point during their stay at the retreat, walked in their sleep to the same precise coordinates in the meadow behind the orchard. Dr. Hartley documented each incident meticulously. He recorded the patient's name, diagnosis, date of admission, date of the sleepwalking episode, time of discovery, and physical condition upon being found. He noted weather conditions, moon phases, and any unusual events that had occurred at the facility in the preceding days. No pattern emerged. The episodes occurred in all seasons, under all weather conditions, during all phases of the moon. They affected patients of all backgrounds and diagnoses. The only constant was the destination. In 1903, Hartley commissioned a precise survey of the location. A surveyor from Brattleboro established the coordinates using standard equipment of the era: 42 degrees, 51 minutes, 18 seconds north latitude, 72 degrees, 33 minutes, 42 seconds west longitude. The spot itself was unremarkable. It lay in the center of the meadow, approximately 200 yards from the nearest structure. The ground was level, covered with the same grass that grew throughout the meadow. No stones, no depressions, no visible features distinguished it from the surrounding terrain. Yet patients continued to walk there. Hartley's documentation efforts attracted the attention of the retreat's superintendent, Dr. Frederick Thorne, who initially dismissed the phenomenon as coincidence. The meadow was a finite space. If patients sleepwalked into it randomly, some clustering would naturally occur. The apparent precision of the location was likely an artifact of observer bias, but Hartley persisted. In 1907, he conducted an experiment. He placed wooden stakes at 50-foot intervals throughout the meadow, creating a grid that would allow precise measurement of where sleepwalking patients were found. Over the following year, 11 patients were discovered in the meadow during somnambulant episodes. 9 were found within 10 feet of the surveyed coordinates. The other 2 were found along a direct path between the main building and the coordinates, as if they had been interrupted before reaching their destination. Thorne reviewed the data and authorized a modest excavation of the site, hoping to determine whether some buried feature, a foundation, a well, a forgotten structure, might account for the location's apparent significance. Workers dug to a depth of 6 feet across an area of approximately 20 square feet. They found nothing. The soil was uniform, undisturbed, consistent with the surrounding meadow. No artifacts, no structural remnants, no evidence that anything of note had ever existed at that location. The excavation was filled and the meadow restored. Thorne declared the matter closed, but the sleepwalking continued. Dr. Hartley retired from the Brattleboro retreat in 1912. His successor, a younger physician named Dr. Roland Mercer, inherited both his position and his files, including the extensive documentation of the meadow phenomenon. Mercer was skeptical of his predecessor's work. The meticulous record struck him as obsessive, the surveyed coordinates as meaningless, the entire investigation as a distraction from legitimate medical practice. He discontinued the systematic documentation, though he did not prohibit staff from noting sleepwalking incidents in their standard reports. Those reports, compiled years later by archivists, reveal that the phenomenon continued unabated throughout Mercer's tenure. Between 1912 and 1923, An additional 89 patients were found in the meadow during somnambulant episodes. Of those whose locations were specifically noted, 76 were found at or near the coordinates Hartley had surveyed 20 years earlier. The documentation became sparse after 1923, when changes in treatment philosophy and facility layout reduced the likelihood of patients reaching the meadow unsupervised. Night attendants were increased, doors were secured, and the meadow itself was partially developed. A new staff residence constructed at its southern edge. An access road cut through its western portion. The coordinates remained undisturbed, but the path to them had become more difficult to walk, sleeping, or waking. By 1930, the phenomenon had effectively ended, or at least ceased to be documented. The meadow behind the Brattleboro retreat remained largely unchanged for the following 4 decades. The staff residence, built in 1923, was expanded in 1947 and again in 1962. The access road was paved in 1955. But the central portion of the meadow, including the coordinates Hartley had surveyed, remained open grassland, mowed periodically, but otherwise undeveloped. In 1971, the retreat announced plans to construct a new outpatient services building on the meadow site. The project required extensive site preparation, including grading, drainage installation, and soil testing to assess foundation requirements. During preliminary excavation in July of that year, workers uncovered what they initially believed to be a buried stone wall, a linear arrangement of rocks approximately 3 feet below the surface. The construction foreman, following standard protocol, halted work and contacted the state archaeologist's office. The subsequent investigation revealed that the stones were not a wall, but a deliberate arrangement, a circular formation approximately 15 feet in diameter, constructed from locally sourced granite. The stones had been carefully positioned, their flat surfaces oriented inward, creating what archaeologists described as a ring or enclosure of unknown purpose. The formation lay approximately 170 feet northeast of the coordinates Hartley had documented 70 years earlier. Dating analysis, based on soil stratification and the weathering of the stones, suggested the formation had been constructed between 500 and 800 years earlier, well before European contact with the region. The archaeologists documented the site, photographed the stones, and prepared a preliminary report. The construction project was modified to avoid the area, and the stone formation was reburied for preservation. The retreat's records from that period make no connection between the archaeological discovery and the sleepwalking incidents documented decades earlier. No one thought to compare the locations. The connection was not made until 2008, when a comprehensive archaeological survey of the Brattleboro area was conducted in preparation for a regional development plan. The survey team, using ground-penetrating radar and other modern techniques, re-examined the 1971 site and discovered additional features that earlier investigators had missed. The stone ring was part of a larger complex, a burial ground containing the remains of at least 23 individuals, interred over a period spanning several centuries. The burials predated European settlement by hundreds of years. The individuals represented multiple generations of an indigenous community that had used this site for sacred purposes long before the land became pasture, before the pasture became a meadow, before the meadow became the grounds of a psychiatric institution. The survey team mapped the burial ground with precision, establishing coordinates for each grave and feature. Their report, published in 2010, included a detailed site plan with GPS coordinates accurate to within centimeters. The central point of the burial complex, the approximate geometric center of the grave sites, lay at 42 degrees, 51 minutes, 18 seconds north latitude, 72 degrees, 33 minutes, 42 seconds west longitude. The exact coordinates Dr. Edmund Hartley had surveyed in 1903. the exact location where 156 patients had walked in their sleep. The discovery raised questions that researchers have struggled to answer. How did patients in the late 19th and early 20th centuries navigate while unconscious to coordinates that corresponded to a burial ground no living person knew existed? The indigenous peoples who had used the site had been displaced centuries earlier. No documented European survey had identified the burials. The 1971 excavation had found only the stone ring, not the graves themselves. The complete extent of the site was not known until 2008. Yet, for more than a quarter century, patients at the Brattleboro Retreat had walked unerringly to the heart of that sacred ground. Some researchers have proposed naturalistic explanations, perhaps subtle variations in the meadow's vegetation caused by the decomposition of buried remains created sensory cues that sleepwalking patients unconsciously detected. Perhaps underground water patterns altered by the burial site's soil disturbance produced vibrations or sounds that guided somnambulant footsteps. These explanations account for the location, but not for the selectivity. Thousands of patients were treated at the retreat between 1897 and 1923. Only 156 walked to the coordinates. What distinguished them from the others? Dr. Hartley's records provide no answer. The sleepwalkers shared no common diagnosis, no common background, no common history. They were connected only by their destination. The Brattleboro Retreat continues to operate today, though the meadow has been substantially developed. The outpatient services building constructed in the early 1970s stands approximately 200 feet from the burial site, which remains protected under state and federal preservation laws. The coordinates themselves are now marked by a small brass plaque installed in 2012 at the request of representatives from the Abenaki Nation. The plaque acknowledges the site's indigenous heritage without specifying its exact nature or history. Patients at the retreat no longer have unsupervised access to the grounds at night. Modern security systems and treatment protocols have eliminated the circumstances that allowed earlier generations to wander. But staff members who have worked at the facility for many years occasionally report unusual occurrences. Patients who speak in their sleep sometimes describe walking through a meadow that no longer exists as they knew it. Night attendants sometimes find residents standing at windows that face the developed grounds, staring at a point in the middle distance. One nurse interviewed in 2015 for an oral history project documenting the retreat's evolution described a patient who woke from a somnambulant episode in tears. She said she'd been walking to find them, the nurse recalled. I asked her who. She said she didn't know their names. She said they'd been waiting a very long time. She said they were still waiting. The nurse paused before continuing. I asked her where they were waiting. She pointed out the window toward the outpatient building. There, she said, right there. Can't you feel them? The nurse could not, but 156 patients across 26 years had felt something, some pull, some summons, some ancient gravity that drew their sleeping bodies across a meadow to stand at the center of a place where the dead had been laid to rest centuries before anyone thought to build a hospital on the land above them. The burial ground remains, the coordinates remain, and somewhere beneath the grass and soil and pavement, the sleepers continue their patient vigil, waiting perhaps for others to find them, waiting for someone to understand why they called out in the only language the unconscious mind can hear, waiting to be remembered by those who walk without knowing where they are going. The ledger counted patients who had never been admitted and prescribed mathematics that had not yet been invented. Mary Fletcher Hospital opened in 1876 on a hillside overlooking Burlington, Vermont, where Lake Champlain stretches toward the Adirondack Mountains of New York. The hospital was named for the wife of a wealthy Burlington merchant who had donated the land and initial construction funds following her death from consumption. Fletcher had envisioned a facility that would serve all residents of the Champlain Valley regardless of their ability to pay. A progressive ideal that shaped the institution's character for more than a century. Burlington itself was Vermont's largest city, a commercial hub whose wharves and rail yards connected the agricultural communities of the interior to markets in Boston, New York, and Montreal. The city had grown prosperous on lumber and wool, and its leading citizens had channeled that prosperity into institutions of education and charity: the University of Vermont, various churches and libraries, and Mary Fletcher Hospital. The hospital expanded steadily through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, adding wings for surgical services, maternity care, and specialized treatment. A psychiatric ward was established in 1904, initially occupying a converted residential building before moving to a purpose-built structure in 1923. The pharmacy, which supplied medications to all departments, occupied a suite of rooms in the main building's basement, a location chosen for its consistent temperature and distance from patient areas. For more than a century, the pharmacy operated without incident, dispensing medications according to physician orders and maintaining meticulous records of every transaction, or so everyone believed. The discovery occurred in March 1989 during a renovation project intended to modernize the pharmacy's facilities. The original dispensing area, largely unchanged since the 1920s, was to be gutted and rebuilt with new cabinetry, computerized inventory systems, and improved climate control. Workers removing the old wooden cabinets discovered that one section of the wall behind them was not solid brick, as the building's plans indicated, but rather a false partition constructed from plaster over a wooden frame. The partition, approximately 8 feet wide and extending from floor to ceiling, concealed a shallow alcove that appeared to have been deliberately hidden. Inside the alcove was a single item, a leather-bound ledger, approximately 14 inches tall and 10 inches wide, its cover worn but intact. The ledger was coated with decades of accumulated dust, and its pages had yellowed with age, but the contents remained legible. The construction foreman, following hospital protocol for unexpected discoveries, secured the ledger and notified the facility's administration. The hospital's chief of staff, Dr. Margaret Thornton, examined the document and immediately recognized its significance. The ledger contained pharmacy records, medication names, dosages, patient identifiers, and dates of dispensation. The entries spanned from 1926 to 1954, covering nearly 3 decades of pharmaceutical activity. But the records did not match anything in the hospital's official archives. The discrepancies were apparent from the first page. The ledger documented medication distributions to patients identified by number rather than name: patient 714, patient 729, patient 703, following a coding system that appeared nowhere in Mary Fletcher Hospital's historical records. The medications themselves were recognizable: barbiturates, bromides, chloral hydrate, and other sedatives common to psychiatric treatment in the mid-20th century. But the ward designations were impossible. Each entry included a location code indicating where the medication had been delivered. The codes referenced Ward 7, a designation that, according to the hospital's architectural plans and administrative records, had never existed. Mary Fletcher Hospital's psychiatric department had operated in Wards 4, 5, and 6 during the period covered by the ledger. Ward 7 appeared in no building plans, no staffing records, no patient census documents. The hospital's numbering system had never included a Ward 7. The designation was, as far as any official documentation indicated, meaningless. Yet the ledger documented thousands of medication distributions to patients in Ward 7 over a period of 28 years. Dr. Thornton authorized a discreet investigation, assigning the task to a hospital archivist named Helen Kazanjian, who spent the following 6 months attempting to trace the ledger's origins and identify the patients and locations it referenced. Kazanjian's investigation yielded more questions than answers. The handwriting in the ledger appeared to belong to at least 3 different individuals, based on variations in letter formation and ink color. None of the handwriting samples matched known pharmacy staff from the relevant period, though personnel records from before 1940 were incomplete. The medications documented in the ledger were consistent with psychiatric treatment practices of the era, but the dosages were unusual. Rather than following standard protocols, the amounts varied according to a pattern that Kazanjian could not immediately identify. Patient 7 to 14, for example, received 25 milligrams of phenobarbital on January 3, 1927, followed by 50 milligrams on January 10th, 75 milligrams on January 17th, and so on, a progression that increased by 25 milligrams each week. Other patients showed similar patterns, though the specific sequences varied. Some received dosages that doubled with each administration. Others followed more complex progressions involving prime numbers or alternating increases and decreases. Kazanjian, whose expertise was in archival research rather than mathematics, noted the patterns but could not interpret their significance. She documented her findings in a preliminary report submitted to Dr. Thornton in October 1989. The report recommended further investigation by specialists in pharmaceutical history and medical mathematics. No such investigation was authorized. The hospital was in the midst of a merger with the University of Vermont's Medical Center, and administrative attention was focused elsewhere. The ledger was cataloged, placed in archival storage, and largely forgotten for more than a decade. The ledger's significance was not recognized until 2002, when a University of Vermont mathematician named Dr. Isaac Okonkwo encountered a reference to it while researching the history of pharmaceutical dosing protocols. Okonkwo's specialty was mathematical sequences in medical applications, the formulas that govern how drug concentrations change over time, how dosages should be adjusted based on patient response, and how treatment protocols can be optimized using mathematical models. He had learned of the ledger through a footnote in Kazanjian's 1989 report, which had been incorporated into a broader study of Vermont medical history. Intrigued by the description of unusual dosage patterns, he requested access to the original document. What he found astonished him. The dosage sequences in the ledger were not random variations or idiosyncratic practices. They corresponded to a specific mathematical framework known as fractal dosing, a method of calculating medication amounts based on self-similar patterns that repeat at different scales. Fractal dosing had been proposed in a 1978 paper by a team of pharmacologists at Stanford University. It was considered a theoretical innovation, a new approach to personalized medicine that took advantage of emerging insights from chaos theory and fractal geometry. The approach had gained modest acceptance in the 1980s and 90s, but remained relatively obscure outside specialized circles. The ledger documented fractal dosing sequences beginning in 1926, more than 50 years before the concept was formally introduced to medical literature. Okonkwo's analysis, conducted over several months, confirmed the impossible correspondence. The dosage patterns in the shadow ledger matched the mathematical specifications published in the 1978 Stanford paper with remarkable precision. The sequences followed the same recursive formulas, the same scaling ratios, the same underlying logic. The only difference was that the ledger's entries predated the theory by half a century. Okonkwo presented his findings at a regional mathematics conference in 2003, framing the discovery as a historical curiosity, an apparent case of independent development where a forgotten practitioner had stumbled upon principles that would not be formally articulated for decades. But privately, he found this explanation unsatisfying. The fractal dosing patterns in the ledger were not approximations or intuitive guesses. They were precise implementations of a mathematical framework that required knowledge of concepts, Mandelbrot sets, recursive self-similarity, chaos theory, that did not exist in the 1920s. Whoever had designed those dosage sequences had access to mathematical tools that would not be developed for another 50 years. Okonkwo attempted to trace the ledger's authorship, hoping to identify the individual or individuals responsible for the entries. His research led him to Mary Fletcher Hospital's personnel records, which he examined with the assistance of the hospital's current archival staff. No pharmacy employee from the 1926 to 1954 period could be connected to the ledger. The 3 handwriting samples did not match any known staff members. The medication inventory records from the official pharmacy showed no discrepancies that would account for the quantities documented in the shadow ledger. The medications had been dispensed. The patients had received them. The mathematics had been applied with precision. But no one knew who had done the dispensing, who had received the medications, or where Ward 7 had ever existed. The investigation might have ended there, as an unsolved historical mystery, had Okonkwo not made one additional discovery. While examining the ledger's final pages, he noticed that the entries from 1954, the last year documented, included marginal notations in a 4th handwriting style, distinct from the 3 that appeared elsewhere in the document. The notations were brief, consisting primarily of numbers and abbreviated references. Most were illegible or cryptic. But one, written in the margin of the final entry dated December 19, 1954, was clear enough to transcribe "Sequence complete. Results transferred to primary archive. Ward 7 closed per directive. Subjects relocated." Below this notation was a second line, written in what appeared to be the same hand. "Continue observation through Protocol 19. Duration indefinite." Okonkwo searched for any reference to Protocol 19 in the hospital's records, in Vermont State Medical Archives, and in national databases of historical pharmaceutical research. He found nothing. The University of Vermont's mathematics department, which had provided modest support for Okonkwo's research, declined to fund further investigation. The project was deemed historically interesting but professionally peripheral, a polite way of indicating that the work was unlikely to generate publications or grants. Okonkwo completed a brief paper documenting the fractal dosing correspondence, which was published in an obscure journal of mathematical history in 2004. The paper received minimal attention. The ledger was returned to Mary Fletcher Hospital's archives, where it remains today, cataloged, preserved, and largely unexamined. But the story does not quite end there. In 2016, a graduate student at the University of Vermont named Priya Ramaswamy was researching the history of psychiatric treatment in the Champlain Valley when she encountered Okonkwo's 2004 paper. The reference to Ward 7 caught her attention. Ramaswamy had been examining 19th and early 20th century building permits filed with the city of Burlington, searching for documentation of hospital expansions and modifications. Among the permits she discovered was one dated March 1925, authorizing construction of a temporary medical annex on the Mary Fletcher Hospital grounds. The permit described a single-story wooden structure, approximately 2,000 square feet, to be used for specialized treatment services. The structure was to be located on the hospital's eastern boundary, adjacent to a service road that no longer existed. The permit had been approved but never formally closed, meaning the city had no record of the structure being completed, inspected, or demolished. Ramaswamy searched for any other reference to the annex in hospital records, city planning documents, and historical photographs. She found only one. A 1927 aerial photograph of the Burlington waterfront, taken for a commercial mapping project. In the photograph's corner, barely visible at the edge of the frame, was a small rectangular building on the Mary Fletcher Hospital grounds. A building that appeared in no other photograph, no architectural plan, no hospital record. The building's approximate location corresponded to the eastern boundary described in the 1925 permit. It stood where Ward 7 might have been. Ramaswamy attempted to investigate further, but the trail had grown cold. The permit file contained no additional documentation. The aerial photograph showed too little detail to provide useful information. The hospital's grounds had been extensively redeveloped since the 1920s, and no trace of the annex, if it had ever existed, remained visible. She noted her findings in her dissertation, which was completed in 2018. The reference occupies a single footnote, identifying the permit anomaly as an unresolved discrepancy in the historical record. The shadow ledger remains in storage. The mathematics it contains, the fractal sequences, the recursive dosing patterns, the precise calculations that predated their formal discovery by half a century, remains unexplained. And somewhere in the space between official records and hidden alcoves, between documented wards and impossible designations, between known mathematics and knowledge that should not yet have existed, the patients of Ward 7 received their medications according to a protocol that no one remembers creating. Patient 714, Patient 729, Patient 703, numbers without names, dosages without explanation, a ward without walls. The ledger documented everything, but some records are kept in places that do not appear on any plan. And some knowledge arrives before its time, carried by hands that left no other trace, administered to patients who exist only in columns of figures that count what was given and never record what was taken away. The patients remembered deaths they had never witnessed, in a ward that did not exist when the memories were first recorded. The Vermont State Asylum for the Insane occupied a sprawling campus in Waterbury where the Winooski River curves through a valley shadowed by the Green Mountains. Founded in 1891, the institution had grown rapidly to accommodate Vermont's expanding population of individuals deemed unable to care for themselves. By the turn of the century, the original Kirkbride Plan building had been supplemented by additional wings, outbuildings, and auxiliary structures that spread across nearly 200 acres of former farmland. Ward D was constructed in 1900, a three-story brick addition to the main building's northern end. The ward was designed to house male patients requiring close observation, those whose conditions made them unpredictable, potentially dangerous to themselves or others, or simply too disturbed to be managed in the general population. The architecture reflected this purpose: reinforced doors, windows set high in the walls, a central nursing station with sightlines to every room. The ward opened for patients in January 1901. It would operate continuously for more than 8 decades, housing thousands of men whose names and histories would largely be forgotten by the world outside the asylum's walls. But the patients of Ward D would remember things that no one else could explain, things that had not yet happened when they were first written down. The phenomenon was first documented in the spring of 1903, when a patient named Thomas Gallagher began describing in vivid detail the death of another patient who had preceded him in the ward. Gallagher had been admitted in February of that year, transferred from a private hospital in Burlington following a complete mental collapse. He was 47 years old, a former railroad clerk who had stopped speaking coherently after witnessing a fatal accident at the Waterbury rail yard. His diagnosis was listed as traumatic dementia, and his prognosis was poor. Within 3 weeks of his arrival, Gallagher began talking about a man named Edmund, a patient who had died in Ward D 14 months earlier, in December 1901. The details Gallagher provided were specific and disturbing. He described Edmund choking on his own blood, his hands clawing at his throat, a nurse named Sarah holding him down while another ran for help that arrived too late. He described the color of the sheets, the sound Edmund made as he struggled to breathe, the way the morning light fell through the window as the man died. Gallagher had never met Edmund. He had been living in Burlington during Edmund's admission and death, with no connection to the asylum or its staff. He could not have known these details. Yet when the attending physician, Dr. Howard Aldrich, reviewed Edmund's death record, he found a straightforward notation: patient expired December 14, 1901. Cause: cardiac failure. Death peaceful, no distress observed. The official record contradicted everything Gallagher had described. The doctor. Aldrich might have dismissed Gallagher's account as delusion, the confused ramblings of a damaged mind, had he not mentioned the incident to a senior nurse named Margaret Connolly during evening rounds. Connolly's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Her face went pale, and she asked Aldrich to repeat exactly what Gallagher had said. When he finished, Connolly was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke. "The official record is incorrect," she said. "Edmund did not die peacefully. He choked on blood from a hemorrhage in his throat. I was there. I held him down while Ruth Kimball went for help. It happened exactly as your patient described." She paused before continuing. "But I never told anyone. The physician on duty that night, Dr. Hastings, recorded the death as cardiac failure because he said a hemorrhage would require an investigation, and Edmund had no family to demand one. I was young. I didn't argue. I've never spoken of it until now." Aldrich asked if there was any way Gallagher could have learned these details. "No," Connolly said. "I have told no one. Not in 20 months. Not until this moment." Over the following years, similar incidents accumulated. Patients admitted to Ward D would describe, unprompted, the deaths of patients who had preceded them, deaths they could not have witnessed, involving individuals they had never met. The descriptions were consistent in their pattern. They emerged within the first few weeks of admission, often during periods of apparent lucidity. The patients spoke as if recounting memories rather than hallucinations, calm, detailed, certain of what they were describing. And in nearly every case, the details contradicted official death records, but matched the private recollections of staff members who had been present. Dr. Aldrich began documenting the incidents systematically in 1905, creating a separate file that he kept apart from official patient records. By 1912, the file contained 43 cases. By 1920, it contained 91. The patients who exhibited the phenomenon shared no common diagnosis, no common background, no common history. They ranged in age from 19 to 73. Some were violent, others passive. Some had been ill for years before admission, others had experienced sudden onset of symptoms. Their only connection was Ward D itself. In 1922, Aldrich shared his documentation with a colleague at the University of Vermont, a psychologist named Dr. Franklin Mercer, who specialized in memory and cognition. Mercer visited the asylum twice that year, interviewing patients and reviewing Aldrich's files. His assessment, delivered in a letter dated November 1922, offered no explanation but confirmed the pattern's validity. "I can find no conventional mechanism by which these patients could have acquired the knowledge they demonstrate," Mercer wrote. They describe events that occurred before their admission, in detail that matches confidential testimony from staff members who have never discussed these events publicly. The phenomenon appears genuine, though its cause remains entirely obscure. Mercer suggested several possibilities: telepathy, which was then being studied at various universities, unconscious communication through subtle cues, or some form of environmental memory, in which traumatic events left traces that sensitive individuals could perceive. None of these explanations satisfied Aldrich, who continued his documentation without reaching any conclusion. The phenomenon persisted until 1927, when Ward D was closed for renovation following a fire that damaged the building's upper floor. Patients were transferred to other wards and the systematic documentation ended. When Ward D reopened in 1929, with new construction and a reorganized patient population, the phenomenon was not observed again. Whatever the patients had been remembering, it seemed tied to the original structure, or to something within it. The explanation, such as it was, did not emerge until 1984, when the Vermont State Hospital was preparing to commemorate the institution's approaching centennial. A committee of staff members and local historians was assembled to plan the celebration, and part of their work involved researching the hospital's early history. Among the documents they uncovered was a reference to a time capsule buried on the hospital grounds in 1898, 3 years before Ward D opened. The time capsule had been created as part of an earlier anniversary celebration, marking the asylum's first decade of operation. It contained various items of institutional significance: photographs, administrative documents, patient census records, and, according to a handwritten inventory, personal diaries contributed by nursing staff. The capsule had been buried beneath a stone marker near the main building's entrance. The marker was still visible, though weathered and partially obscured by landscaping. The committee authorized its excavation. The time capsule was recovered in October 1984. Its contents were largely intact, protected by a lead-lined container that had resisted water infiltration. The photographs had faded, the documents had yellowed, but the diaries, 4 small leather-bound volumes contributed by nurses who had worked at the asylum in its earliest years, remained legible. The committee archivist, a hospital employee named Beverly Stanton, was tasked with cataloging the contents. She spent 3 weeks examining the materials, transcribing relevant passages, and preparing a summary report. Her report, delivered in January 1985, contained a finding that she could not explain. The diaries included detailed accounts of patient deaths that had occurred between 1892 and 1897, years before Ward D existed. The nurses had recorded these events privately, documenting details that did not appear in official records: violent deaths recorded as peaceful, accidents concealed as natural causes, suffering erased from the institutional record. Many of these deaths had occurred in the building's northern wing, the same location where Ward D would be constructed 3 years later, and the details in the diaries matched precisely the descriptions that Ward D patients would provide decades later. The correspondence was unmistakable. Patients admitted to Ward D between 1901 and 1927 had described deaths that occurred between 1892 and 1897 in a building that would later be replaced by their ward. They had described details that appeared nowhere in official records, details that had been written down only in private diaries sealed in a time capsule buried 3 years before the ward opened, details that no living person could have shared with them because the diaries had been underground, unread, for nearly a century. Beverly Stanton brought her findings to the attention of the Centennial Committee, which reviewed the evidence and reached no conclusion. The correspondence was documented in an appendix to the anniversary publication, framed as a historical curiosity without interpretation or explanation. The diaries were donated to the Vermont Historical Society, where they remain available to researchers. The time capsule's other contents were displayed briefly during the centennial celebration and then returned to storage. Dr. Aldrich's documentation of the Ward D phenomenon was discovered in the hospital's archives in 1992 during a records review conducted as part of the facility's gradual closure. His files were transferred to the state archives in Montpelier, where they were cataloged but not examined in detail. No one connected Aldrich's records to the time capsule discovery until 2011, when a graduate student researching the history of memory in psychiatric treatment encountered both sources independently and recognized the correspondence. The graduate student, whose name was Marcus Lindqvist, attempted to publish his findings in an academic journal. His paper was rejected by 3 publications, each citing concerns about the evidence's provenance and the implausibility of the claims. "The correspondence you document is striking," one reviewer wrote, "but it suggests a phenomenon for which no scientific framework exists. Without a mechanism to explain how patients could access information sealed in a time capsule, the paper reads as an argument for the supernatural rather than a contribution to historical scholarship." Lindqvist completed his dissertation on a different topic. His research on Ward D appears only in a footnote, referencing the sources without analysis. The diaries remain in the Historical Society's collection. Aldrich's files remain in the state archives. And somewhere in the space between what was written and what was remembered, between deaths that were concealed and knowledge that emerged decades later, the patients of Ward D continue to hold their impossible memories, memories of events they never witnessed, recorded in books they never read, buried in ground they never walked. The ward is gone now. The original building was demolished in 2014, but the ground remains, the same ground where the time capsule lay for nearly a century, the same ground where patients died in ways that official records denied, the same ground that somehow transmitted what it knew to minds that should have had no way of receiving it. Memory is not supposed to work this way. The dead are not supposed to speak to the living. The past is not supposed to reach forward and plant itself in minds that did not exist when it occurred. But the diaries were sealed in 1898, and the patients began remembering in 1901. And everything they remembered was true. He marked the days they disappeared, and no one knew where they went. The Weeks School occupied a hillside campus outside Vergennes, Vermont, where the Otter Creek widens on its way to Lake Champlain. Originally established in 1865 as the Vermont Reform School, the institution had evolved over the following century from a facility for juvenile offenders into a residential home for individuals with developmental disabilities. The name changed in 1910 to honor a former superintendent, but the essential character of the place remained constant, a world apart, where those deemed unfit for ordinary society were housed, fed, and largely forgotten. Vergennes itself was Vermont's smallest city, a compact grid of streets surrounded by farmland and forest. The school sat at the town's northern edge, its brick buildings visible from the main road that connected Vergennes to Burlington. Generations of local families had worked at the facility, their labor forming an unbroken chain that stretched back to the institution's founding. Among those who spent their lives in service to the Weeks School was a groundskeeper named Einar Lindstrom, who began working at the facility in 1938 and remained until his death in 1969. Lindstrom was a quiet man, a Swedish immigrant who had arrived in Vermont in 1929 and found steady work maintaining the grounds of various institutions throughout the Champlain Valley. He lived alone in a small cottage on the school's property, tending the lawns and gardens with meticulous care and speaking to colleagues only when necessary. When Lindstrom died of a stroke in November 1969, the school's administration arranged for his cottage to be cleared and his belongings disposed of. He had no known family, no will, and few possessions of value. But among the items recovered from his quarters was a calendar, not the current year's calendar, but a collection of pages spanning 31 years, bound together with twine and covered with handwritten marks that no one could interpret. The calendar pages dated from 1938 to 1969, one page for each year of Lindstrom's employment at the Weeks School. The pages themselves were ordinary, Commercial calendars of the type distributed by banks and feed stores, featuring photographs of Vermont landscapes and agricultural scenes. What made them unusual were the marks. On certain dates throughout each year, Lindstrom had drawn a small symbol in black ink, a circle with a diagonal line through it, approximately the size of a fingernail. The symbol appeared on seemingly random dates, sometimes clustered together, sometimes months apart. There was no obvious pattern, no correlation with weekends or holidays or seasons. The facility's administrator at the time, a man named Harold Worthington, examined the calendar briefly and concluded that it represented some personal system of Lindstrom's, perhaps tracking weather patterns or maintenance tasks or some other aspect of his work. The calendar was placed in a box with Lindstrom's other belongings and stored in the school's basement archive, where it remained for nearly 50 years. Worthington's assessment was reasonable. Groundskeepers often kept informal records of planting schedules, equipment maintenance, and seasonal tasks. A personal notation system, however cryptic, was not inherently suspicious. But Worthington had not counted the marks. Over 31 years, Lindstrom had marked exactly 247 dates. 247 circles with diagonal lines, distributed across 3 decades with no apparent logic. The number meant nothing to Worthington. It would mean something to others much later. The week school closed in 1993, its functions transferred to smaller community-based facilities as Vermont reformed its approach to caring for individuals with disabilities. The campus was sold to a private developer, and the buildings were eventually demolished or converted for new purposes. The archival materials from the school's century of operation were transferred to the Vermont State Archives in Montpelier, where they were cataloged and made available to researchers. The collection included administrative records, patient files, staff documentation, and various miscellaneous items, including the box of Einar Lindstrom's belongings, which had traveled from basement to basement for more than 2 decades. The calendar might have remained unexamined indefinitely had it not caught the attention of a historian named Dr. Caroline Oyalaran, who was researching the history of institutional care in Vermont for a comprehensive study commissioned by the state's Department of Disabilities, Aging, and Independent Living. Oyalaran encountered the calendar in 2017 while reviewing materials related to the week school. The cryptic markings intrigued her, and she photographed each page for later analysis. Her initial hypothesis matched Worthington's. The marks likely represented some aspect of Lindstrom's professional duties. But when she attempted to correlate the marked dates with known events at the week school, patient deaths, staff changes, building projects, inspections, she found no correspondence. The marked dates did not align with any documented occurrence in the facility's official records. Oyalaran might have abandoned the investigation had she not made a separate discovery in early 2018. While researching a different aspect of Vermont's institutional history, she learned that the state had recently unsealed a collection of records related to patient transfers between 1935 and 1960. The records had been sealed in 1961 following a legislative inquiry into conditions at Vermont's state institutions. The inquiry had uncovered evidence of irregularities in patient documentation, and certain files had been restricted from public access for reasons that were not specified in the sealing order. The unsealed records, released in 2017 as part of a broader transparency initiative, documented transfers of patients from various Vermont institutions to facilities outside the standard state system. The documentation was fragmentary and often cryptic. Patients were identified by number rather than name. Destination facilities were referenced by codes rather than locations. Many of the transfer orders bore signatures that could not be matched to any known state official. But each transfer included a date. Oyalaran, on a hunch, compared the transfer dates to Lindstrom's marked calendar. The correspondence was exact. Every marked date on Lindstrom's calendar matched a documented transfer from the weak school to an unidentified facility. Every single one. 247 transfers, 247 marks. The discovery raised immediate questions. How had Lindstrom known about the transfers? Why had he tracked them? And where had the patients been sent? The unsealed records provided partial answers to the first two questions. Transfer orders from the weak school indicated that patients were removed from the facility in the early morning hours, typically between 2 and 4 in the morning. The transfers were conducted by personnel identified only by employee numbers, using vehicles that were not part of the school's regular fleet. Lindstrom's cottage sat at the edge of the campus, adjacent to the service road used for deliveries and maintenance access. From his window, he would have had a clear view of any vehicles arriving or departing at unusual hours. He had seen the transfers. He had marked the dates. But he had told no one, at least no one who left any record of being told. The destination of the transfers proved more difficult to determine. The unsealed records referenced facilities by alphanumeric codes: Station K7, Facility M12, Unit B3. No key to these codes existed in the released materials. Oyler searched for any reference to these designations in other state records, in federal archives, in historical newspapers. She found nothing. The facilities, according to every official source, did not exist. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. While presenting her preliminary findings at a conference in 2018, Oyler was approached by a retired state employee named George Thurston, who had worked in Vermont's Department of Records Management from 1971 to 2004. Thurston told her that during his tenure, he had processed a directive to remove certain municipalities from the state's official registry. Towns that had been consolidated into surrounding communities following the 1952 reorganization of Vermont's municipal structure. The consolidation had been routine administrative business, part of a statewide effort to streamline local government in rural areas. But Thurston had noticed something unusual about one batch of removals he processed in 1973. The towns being removed from the registry had never appeared on any map he could find. Their population records showed 0 residents. Their geographic coordinates, when he checked them, corresponded to locations that were described in contemporary records as uninhabited wilderness. The towns had existed only on paper, and then they had been erased from even that limited existence. Thurston had made quiet inquiries at the time, but had been told the matter was an administrative correction of historical errors. He had not pursued it further, but he remembered the names: Kellerton, Morrow Falls, Blackstone Hollow. 3 towns that had never existed except in documents that had been systematically removed. Oyler searched for any connection between the erased towns and the transfer codes in the unsealed records. The connection, when she found it, was circumstantial but compelling. A 1947 internal memo from the Vermont Department of Health, discovered in an unrelated archive, referenced auxiliary treatment facilities located in unincorporated areas of Addison and Rutland counties. The memo discussed staffing requirements, supply deliveries, and patient capacity without specifying the facilities' names or precise locations. But it mentioned that correspondence should be addressed to Station K7, Kellerton, Vermont. Kellerton, one of the towns George Thurston had removed from the registry in 1973. A town that, according to all official records, had never existed. Oyler searched for the geographic coordinates associated with Kellerton in pre-1952 records. She found a single reference in a 1941 highway survey, a notation indicating that State Route 12 passed through the former township of Kellerton, approximately 17 miles east of Middlebury. The location today is uninhabited forest, part of the Green Mountain National Forest. No structures, no roads, no evidence that anyone ever lived there. but the unsealed transfer records indicated that between 1938 and 1960, at least 83 patients were transferred from the week school to Station K7. 83 people sent to a place that officially never existed. None of them appear in any subsequent record. No deaths, no discharges, no further transfers. They simply vanished into a town that someone later decided had never been real. Oyalaran's research was never completed. In 2019, the funding for her comprehensive study was reduced, and the scope of her work was narrowed to exclude what her supervisors termed speculative historical reconstruction. Her findings regarding Lindstrom's calendar, the unsealed transfer records, and the erased municipalities were compiled in a preliminary report that was submitted to the Department of Disabilities, Aging, and Independent Living, but never published. The report recommended further investigation, including archaeological survey of the Kellerton coordinates, forensic analysis of the unsealed records, and interviews with any surviving family members of the transferred patients. No such investigation was authorized. The preliminary report was filed in the department's archives, where it was classified as internal working documentation and exempted from public records requests. Lindstrom's calendar remains in the Vermont State Archives, cataloged but restricted from general access due to ongoing administrative review. The unsealed transfer records have been resealed, pending verification of archival integrity. And somewhere in the Green Mountain National Forest, 17 miles east of Middlebury, the forest grows over land that may once have held buildings, roads, and the people who were sent there and never returned. 247 marks on a groundskeeper's calendar. 247 transfers to facilities that did not exist. 247 people who left the week school in the early morning darkness and were never seen again. Einar Lindstrom watched them go. He marked the dates. He kept his record for 31 years, binding the pages together with twine, hiding them among his few possessions. He never told anyone what he saw, but he made sure someone would know. The towns have been erased. The records have been sealed. The forest has reclaimed whatever stood in those clearings 70 years ago. But the calendar survives, and the marks remain. 247 small circles with diagonal lines, each one representing a person who stepped into a vehicle before dawn and traveled to a destination that the state of Vermont later decided had never existed. Some records are kept in official archives. Others are kept by those who watch and wait and mark the days in silence. Einar Lindstrom kept his record until he died. Now someone else must decide what to do with what he saw.